Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller and I'm here to help you today. I know you watched this video to fall asleep, so before you do that, like it, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Then settle in and relax. The headlights of my old Chevy flickered, giving the empty highway in front of me a spooky glow. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, hoping the car would continue to go a few more miles, but fate had other ideas, and my faithful companion of 5 years began to sputter and wheeze. I gave up the ghost, the engine died, and I coasted to a stop on the shoulder. Darkness surrounded me like a shroud, and I muttered, turning the key desperately, but the engine whined but wouldn't turn over. I slumped back in my seat, the truth of my predicament setting in. I was Sarah Coleman, 28 years old, stranded on a desolate section of Highway 41 at 11:43 p.m. I reached for my phone, which is my lifeline in this modern world, but the signal bars mocked me. One bar flickered in and out, so I dialed 911 anyway, hoping that it would go through. "What's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through the static. "My car broke down on Highway 41, I said, trying not to let the panic escape my voice. "I'm alone and it's dark. Can you send someone? Can you give me your exact location, ma'am?" I squinted at the darkness outside, searching for any landmarks, but I'm not sure. The last sign I saw was for Millbrook about 20 minutes ago. I said, "Okay, I'll send a patrol car to search the area. It might take a while. Can you stay with your vehicle?" My mouth was dry. "How long do you think it'll be given your location?" "It could be up to an hour." I thought of my empty apartment and the friends I'd left behind when I moved for this job. "No, there's no one." I hung up and sat in silence, feeling the weight of my loneliness pressing down on me, interrupted by the occasional whoosh of a passing car on the other side of the highway. Only served to highlight how isolated I was on this side. I rolled down the window a crack to let in the cool night air, and the sound of crickets chirping and wind rustling through the tall grass lining the road made for an eerie background to my vigil. A flicker of light in my rearview mirror caught my attention as headlights approached from behind. Perhaps it was the patrol car earlier than anticipated, but as it got closer, it slowed and I squinted against the glare. It turned out to be an old pickup instead of a patrol car. The truck crawled past me, going well below the speed limit. I couldn't see the driver through the tinted windows, but I felt uneasy as it went by. I was just being cautious, I thought to myself, probably to see if I needed help, but the truck didn't stop and continued down the highway, its red taillights fading into the distance. I let out a breath, not realizing I'd been holding the minutes ticking by with excruciating slowness. I alternated between checking my phone, which was still hardly receiving any signal, and looking for any when the promised patrol car headlights appeared in my rearview mirror once more. My heart leaped but then instantly fell when I saw the shape of the pickup truck. It was returning, just like before, and this time it slowed as it got closer to my car, coming to a complete stop about 50 feet behind me. The headlights remained on, illuminating my car in harsh white light. I sat motionless, my hands clenched in my lap, wondering why they weren't pulling up next to me. The truck's engine revved and it pulled out, swinging wide around my car as it passed. I caught a glimpse of the driver, a dark silhouette head turned towards me, but I couldn't make out a face. The truck accelerated away, leaving me in darkness once more, my heart pounding. I couldn't see any movement inside it either, just those headlights pinning me in place like a butterfly on display. My breathing quickened. Should I get out and wave them off? I tried to distract myself by searching through my purse for gum wrappers, loose change, an old pack of tissues, and my fingers rubbing against something cold and metallic. It felt like hours, and it was so hard that I could feel it in my throat. "It's nothing, nothing," I said out loud, trying to convince myself that they were just checking on you twice without stopping to ask if you needed help. Totally normal. I laughed nervously, the sound too loud in the quiet car. I looked at my watch again. Only 20 minutes had passed since I'd called 911. The pickup truck was back, and this time it pulled up right behind me, so close I couldn't see its license plate. The headlights bore into my rearview mirror, filling my car with harsh light, and I squinted to see the driver, but all I could see was a dark shape. I pulled it out and held it tightly as a new sound, a low steady hum, cut through the night. I looked up and I saw dread wearing in my chest, but it wasn't the patrol car. The driver's door opened and I held my breath, my whole body tense. A foot appeared on the running board, then a leg, and the driver was getting out. I fumbled for my phone with trembling hands, but there was no signal and the one bar was gone. A dark figure, tall and broad-shouldered and unmistakably a man, emerged fully from the truck. He stood there for a moment, half illuminated by his own headlights, and then he began to walk towards my car. My mind raced. Should I drive? The engine was dead, but perhaps if I let it roll, the highway was too flat. We sat in tableau for a long time, me rigid in my seat, him looming outside my window, and I waited for him to speak. I'd never built up enough speed. The man was halfway to my car, and I couldn't tell if he was looking at me, but I felt his attention like a physical weight 10 feet away. He stopped right beside my driver's side window, and I clutched the pepper spray, my thumb on the button, and my other hand poised over the car horn. If he tried anything, I'd spray him and lean on the horn. Instead, he just stood there and watched while a single drop of sweat trickled down my back. I tensed, ready to spray, and he knocked on the window twice. "Everything was fine in there, miss." His voice was surprisingly normal, grateful, but not menacing, and I blinked, losing my balance. Yes, I was able to say loud enough to be heard through the glass. "My car broke down, and I'm waiting for a tow." He nodded, taking a small step back now that he wasn't obstructing the light. He was an older man, possibly in his 60s, wearing a trucker's cap and a weathered face. He said, "I saw you sitting here earlier. I thought I'd check to make sure you were all right. It can be dangerous being stranded out here alone." Obviously, he was just being a good Samaritan, and I let my imagination run wild. "Thank you," I said, managing a weak smile. "I appreciate you checking. The police should be here soon." He nodded once more. Good. Well, I'll just before I could react, a new set of headlights appeared on the horizon. As they got closer, I noticed the welcome sight of a patrol car's light bar. The old man turned to face me, then back again. "Looks like your ride's here, miss. Take care now." He walked back to his truck as the patrol car pulled up and an officer got out. The pickup truck then pulled away, disappearing into the night. I rolled down my window as the officer approached. "Are you Sarah Coleman?" When the officer called for a tow truck, I said yes with a wave of relief. "Thank you for coming." I looked in the direction the pickup had gone, wondering if I had overreacted, but as I remembered those lengthy moments of uncertainty and the way the truck had circled back repeatedly, I couldn't get rid of a lingering sense of unease. I'd never know for sure if the old man had just been a concerned citizen or if his intent had been less benign, but one thing was for sure, I'd never look at a deserted highway the same way again. The sound of the barn door reverberated through the still night air, a sound as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, but tonight it sent a chill down my spine because something wasn't right on the farm, and at 73 years old, I'd learned to trust my instincts. When I got into the patrol car to wait for the tow truck, I made a mental note to have my car checked out as soon as possible and perhaps to reconsider that job offer in the city. I've been in my family for 4 generations and I've witnessed drought, floods, and everything in between, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that moonless October night. The day had been normal. I had taken care of the crops, fed the animals, and settled in for a peaceful evening with my dog, Old Blue, until the clock struck midnight. At first, I tried to ignore it, but there was a rhythm to it. Old farms make all kinds of noises, especially on windy nights. I sat up in bed, my joints protesting the sudden movement, and it came from the barn. Old Blue lifted his head, his ears perked, and he heard it too. "What do you think, boy?" I murmured, reaching for my glasses, and said, "Should we check it out?" Old Blue's tail thumped against the bed in response, so at least I wouldn't be facing whatever it was alone. I put on my boots and took the flashlight from my nightstand. Its weight was comforting in my hand, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that it might not be enough. The barn's noises became more distinct as I made my way downstairs, creaking Old Blue padding behind me. There was a clanging sound like metal on metal, followed by a thud that made me jump. I stopped at the back door, my hand on the knob, and part of me wanted to go back to sleep, pull the covers over my head, and act like this was all a bad dream, but I knew I couldn't because this was my land, my responsibility. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside. The moon was obscured by heavy clouds. As I approached the barn, the noises abruptly stopped, and the silence was almost worse than the sounds had been. It felt expectant, like the entire world was holding its breath. I reached for the barn door, my hand trembling slightly, and took a deep breath. By pulling it open, I could smell the familiar smell of hay and animals washed away. The Old Blue growled low in his throat, and the hair on his back stood up. "Easy, boy," I whispered, though my own heart was pounding. I swept my flashlight around the interior, taking in the familiar sight of stalls and farm equipment, but something else was strange. Everything appeared normal until my eyes fell on my old tractor, which had been moved out of its usual spot in the corner, tools scattered around it, glinting in the flashlight's beam. "Hello," I called out, sounding thin and wry, but there was no answer. I could swear I heard a shuffling sound coming from the back of the barn, Old Blue wind pressing against my leg. I reached down to Pat's head as much for my comfort as his. I took a few more steps with my flashlight beam dancing across the walls when I saw that the footprints weren't mine. They were bigger and had an unfamiliar tread pattern. They led me deeper into the barn toward the back where we kept the hay bales, and my throat went dry. I should have gone back and called the sheriff, but because I was curious, or perhaps stubborn, I followed the footprints, my heart thumping loudly. As we approached the rear of the barn, I heard it breathing softly, but I knew that someone was hiding behind the stack of hay bales. I stopped my flashlight and trained it on the spot, trying to keep my voice steady, saying, "Come on out now, and we can talk about this for a long moment." Nothing happened, but slowly a figure appeared from behind the hay, and my flashlight illuminated a young man who was barely more than a boy, really, with ragged clothes and a smudged face. His voice was hoarse. "I didn't take anything, I just needed a place to sleep." I lowered the flashlight a little to check him out. He was too thin, and his eyes had a haunted look that spoke of hard times. "What's your name, son?" I asked, my initial fear turning to concern for Michael. "Still tense, ready to bolt at any moment," he replied. I nodded, since this wasn't the first time I'd found someone seeking shelter in the barn, even though it had been years of hardship all around. "Are you hungry, Michael?" He hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. I sighed, feeling the weight of my years. "Come on up to the house, we'll get you something to eat, and you can tell me your story." Michael's eyes widened in surprise. "You're not calling the police, not unless you give me a reason to," I said. "Now come on, it's too cold to stand around jawing all night." As we made our way back to the house, Old Blue trotting ahead, I couldn't help but think about the events of the previous night. It all seemed a little silly now, but as Michael entered the back porch's light, I noticed something that made me stop. Peeking out from under his sleeve was a tattoo, a symbol I recognized from news reports about a series of burglaries in the area. Our eyes met, and I saw the instant he realized I'd noticed tension crackling in the air between us. I had a choice to make. This boy was obviously involved in something bad, but he was also just a hungry, scared, and lonely kid. I said, "Let's get you that food," and finally opened the door. "Then we're going to have a long talk about the choices you've been making," Michael said, hesitating for a moment before nodding in relief and trepidation. I knew that night was still a long way off and that there would be difficult conversations ahead, possibly even a call to the sheriff, but for now there was hot food to be made and maybe a lost soul to be led back to the correct path. The barn door creaked once more as a gust of wind blew across the farm, but this time, as I watched Michael gobble up a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, I couldn't help but think that perhaps the real intruder I'd faced tonight wasn't there. The sound didn't make me feel afraid, rather it reminded me of all the stories these old buildings had told, stories of hardship, yes, but also of redemption and second chances. I shut the door behind us, blocking out the darkness. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight there would be warmth, food, and an opportunity for understanding, and sometimes that's all it takes to change a life. Old Blue settled at my feet, his watchful eyes never leaving Michael, and I realized that the intruder had given me something priceless, a reminder that even at my age, there were still new things to discover. In the barn, there was fear of the unknown, fear of the world changing outside of my familiar routines. By facing that fear and choosing compassion over suspicion, I had the potential to change not only this young man's life but also mine. The night's adventure had begun with a creaking barn door and unexplained noises, but it was ending with the opportunity to truly make a difference in someone's life, and isn't that the greatest adventure of all, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights? I poured another cup of coffee and got ready for what promised to be a lengthy and difficult conversation, but for the first time in years I felt truly awake and truly alive. As I reached for a paper towel, I noticed my reflection in the mirror. The bags under my eyes told a story of sleepless nights and endless miles. Little did I know that those tired eyes were about to witness something that would haunt me for years to come. My name is Alex, and this was supposed to be a simple road trip. My girlfriend Megan and I were driving cross-country to start a new job, and the lights made the rest stop bathroom feel like an operating room, sterile and unforgiving. When we pulled into the rest stop, it was just after midnight. The parking lot was almost empty except for a few semi-trucks and a beat-up RV. Megan had been sleeping for the last 100 miles with her head resting against the passenger window. "Hey," I said softly and gently shaking her shoulder, "we're stopping for a bit. Do you need anything?" She stirred, blinking owlishly in the harsh overhead lights of our new life together in California. The night air was cool as I got out of the car, a welcome change from the stuffy interior. I stretched, feeling my spine pop in multiple places. The rest stop loomed before me, an oasis of light in the vast darkness of the surrounding area. "The car has some water and a snack." I nodded, grabbing my wallet from the center console. "I'll be right back. Lock the doors, okay?" She mumbled in the affirmative, already drifting back to sleep. I watched her for a moment, a tiny smile on my lips, even though I was exhausted and rumpled from the long drive. The interior of the rest stop was bright and empty, and as I got closer to the building, I noticed a man leaning against the wall near the entrance. He was smoking a cigarette, and something about him made me uneasy. Perhaps it was the way his eyes followed me as I passed by, or the too wide smile he gave me that evening. He said, his voice growly, and I nodded in response, quickening my pee pace a little. The sooner I got in and out, the better. I grabbed a few water bottles and some snacks from the vending machines and went to the bathroom, where I found myself staring at my reflection and trying to get rid of an unexplained feeling of dread. I dried my hands and gathered our supplies, eager to get back to Megan and hit the rope again, but as I pushed open the bathroom door, I almost ran into someone. It was the man from outside. He stumbled back, apologizing profusely, but I muttered, trying to avoid him, but he didn't move and instead fixed me with that unnerving look. He asked, "Smile again, you have a long drive ahead of you." I nodded, not wanting to argue, but also not wanting to be impolite. "Hey, heading to California," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Long way from here, you're traveling alone." I thought of Megan alone in the car, so I firmly said, "No, my girlfriends are waiting for me. We should get going." He held up his hands, still grinning, and I hurried past him, resisting the urge to turn around. Of course, drive safely. As I got closer, I noticed Megan's silhouette through the window, her head still resting against the glass. I tapped on the window to avoid waking her, but she didn't respond, so I tried the handle, locked just as I'd asked her to do. "Good girl, Megan," I called, knocking a little louder. "I'm back. Can you unlock the door?" But then there was still no movement from inside the car, so I took a deep breath to try to calm my racing heart. Megan woke up, but I knocked harder, my knuckles rapping sharply against the glass. My heart started racing, so I pressed my face against the window and cupped my hands around my eyes to block out the glare from the overhead lights. The car was empty, and I staggered back, my mind reeling. Where could she have gone? I ran back to the rest stop building, bursting through the doors, and the man I'd met earlier wasn't there. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing. I sprinted to the women's restroom, ignoring the sign, and pushed open the door. I called out, "Are you in here?" And each stall stood empty, mocking me with their silence. Back outside, I circled our car, searching for any clue as to where Megan might have gone, when I saw a small scrap of fabric caught on the door handle. I knew right away that it was from the sweater Megan had been wearing, and my blood ran cold. Misunderstanding or a practical joke gone wrong. Something had happened to Megan. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking, and dialed 911. "What's your emergency, my girlfriend?" I gasped, struggling to keep my voice steady. "And she's missing. We're at a rest stop on Highway 40, about 50 miles east of Flagstaff." I went inside for a short while, and when I returned, she was gone. The dispatcher's voice was calm, which was a sharp contrast to the panic pulsing through me. "Sir, we're dispatching officers to your location, and the dispatcher assured me that they should be there in 20 minutes. In the meantime, don't touch anything in or around your vehicle, as it could be important evidence." The word hit me like a punch to the gut, and I paced the parking lot in the hopes that I would see your girlfriend. Megan, who is 56 years old, has green eyes and long brown hair, and was last seen wearing jeans and a blue sweater. I couldn't bring myself to finish the thought as the minutes passed by, each second feeling like an eternity, and I kept expecting to wake up to discover that this was all some terrible nightmare caused by too many hours of driving and too much gas. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had Megan left voluntarily? No, that wasn't possible. We were happy and excited about our new life together, and she wouldn't have left without her phone or purse, both of which were still in the car where she had left them. Station coffee, but the way the officers approached me made it seem all too real. 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, their lights painting the scene and flashing red and blue alternately. As the officers got closer, I found it difficult to breathe. I said, "Are you the one who called about a missing person?" With a mask of professional concern on his face, I nodded and swallowed hard. My girlfriend Megan was in the car when I went inside, and when I returned, she was as the officers started their investigation, searching the area and questioning the few other people at the rest stop. I stood by helplessly, and the man I'd seen earlier was nowhere to be found. Hours passed in a blur of questions, phone calls, and growing dread as the first light of dawn began to streak the sky. You're sure she didn't just step out for some air, because she would have told me I insisted, and her belongings are still in the car. As I watched the sun rise over the desert, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot, I was struck by the chilling realization that our road trip, which was supposed to be the beginning of our new life together, had instead become the beginning of a very different journey, one that I feared might never end in the harsh glare. Megan had disappeared into the night, as if she had never existed. The rest of the trip, which had once been just another anonymous waypoint on our journey, had become the focal point of a nightmare. As the investigation got underway in earnest, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't rest until I had the answers. Once a symbol of freedom and possibility, the open road now stretched before me like an endless question mark. Where was Megan? What had happened in those few short minutes I was away? And most terrifyingly, would I ever see her again? The rest lights gave way to the soft glow of morning, but the shadows of that night would linger much longer in the space of a few minutes. 5 days into what should have been the trip of a lifetime, I couldn't get rid of the chill that had set in deep within my bones, and all I could think about was the empty cabin next door and the growing knot of dread in my stomach. Regardless of how grim the truth may be, our journey had taken an unexpected and horrifying detour, and I was now starting the most important trip of my life, the search for Megan and the truth behind that fateful night at the rest stop. I'm Emily Chun, 34, a usually overworked software engineer from Seattle, and this cruise was meant to be my reward for finishing a big project. 7 days of tropical bliss, fruity drinks, and a blessed break from the digital world were all part of the plan. But on day 5, I found myself wishing desperately for my laptop and access to any information that might help explain what was happening. It had begun innocently enough on the second. During the muster drill on the first day of the cruise, I realized that I hadn't seen my cabin neighbor since we'd left port. Her name was Sarah, and she was traveling alone for her 40th birthday. She seemed excited about the trip and eager to try every activity the ship had to offer. But after that first day, I didn't see her at the restaurants, the pool, or any of the nightly shows. At first, I assumed it was because of our different schedules. Perhaps she was an early riser and went to the gym while I slept in, or maybe she was nursing a wicked sunburn. And remaining in her cabin, I didn't start to worry until the third day. I had knocked on her door with the intention of inviting her to the comedy show that night, but she didn't answer. I tried again later that night, but nothing happened. On day 4, I went to the guest services desk. The young man behind the counter, whose name tag read Aiden, smiled blandly as I explained my concerns. "I'm sure your neighbor is fine, ma'am," he said, his tone a little too rehearsed. "Perhaps she's enjoying her room." I asked, "Could you at least check if she's been using her room key or if she's ordered any room service?" Aiden's smile remained constant, but something flickered in his eyes out of fear and annoyance. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information, ma'am. Passenger privacy. You understand?" I left the desk feeling uneasy, and Aiden's reaction seemed strange. Somehow it was too polished and dismissive. That night, I lay awake in my cabin, trying to hear any noise from as I tossed and turned. I had a new thought. I hadn't just not seen Sarah, but I couldn't remember seeing several of the passengers I'd noticed earlier in the cruise, including the elderly couple who'd sat next to me at the captain's dinner and the rowdy group of college kids who'd been making a splash at the pool bar. Next door, the walls on these ships were thin, so I should have been able to hear something like a TV, footsteps, or the running shower, but instead there was silence, outrageous than the last. And by the time the first rays of dawn reached my window, I had nearly gone into a panic. I spent day 5 observing intently, positioning myself in the ship's main atrium with a book in my hand for camouflage, and watching the ebb and flow of passengers and crew. It was then that I began to notice the patterns. Crew members speaking in low voices, their eyes darting anxiously, and rerouting passengers with evasive excuses regarding regular maintenance. And the passengers themselves appeared to be fewer in number. The ship didn't feel exactly empty, but it did feel less full than it had been at the beginning of the cruise. Spaces that had been crowded now had breathing room, and lines that had been lengthy now moved quickly. As the day went on, I noticed snippets of conversations with other passengers who shared my concerns, but each time a crew member appeared, it was as if by magic, changing the topic or providing a complimentary drink to divert attention from the inquiries. By evening, I needed answers, so I headed back to the guest services desk, determined to push harder this time. However, as I got closer, I noticed Aiden having a serious conversation with a man I recognized as one of the ship's security officers. I slowed down to try to understand what they were saying without drawing attention to myself because I couldn't keep this going for much longer. Aiden was speaking in his typical polished manner, but everyone was beginning to notice. The security officer nodded grimly. "I know. Good evening, ma'am." Aiden said brightly, "How can we help you today?" I hesitated, my prepared speech dying on my lips. The change in their demeanor had been so abrupt and complete that for a moment I doubted what I'd just seen and heard. "We're doing everything we can, but if we don't find a solution soon," he trailed off as he noticed me approaching. In an instant, both men's faces changed to pleasant smiles, replacing the worry I had just witnessed. The night was gorgeous, the kind of perfect tropical evening you see in travel brochures, with stars glittering overhead and a warm breeze carrying the scent of the breeze. I thanked them and walked away, my head spinning, in the hopes that the fresh air would clear my head. I hated myself for freaking out as Aiden rattled off the evening's activities because my mind was elsewhere, wondering what they couldn't contain, what solution they were looking for, and most importantly, what it had to do with the missing passengers. In any other situation, it would have been paradise. I leaned against the railing and looked out over the dark water, with the ship's wake stretching behind us and a glowing path leading back to what we had left behind. A sound behind me caused me to turn, and as she drew closer, I recognized her. We had talked at the pool on the first day of the cruise, and she couldn't sleep either. She asked, trying to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes, and I shook my head. Had too much on my mind, so I suppose she nodded and joined me at the railing for a long time. We stood silently for a while, both of us gazing out at the vast ocean. "Have you noticed?" She finally said, barely raising her voice above a whisper that people seemed to be vanishing, and my heart raced, so I wasn't alone. "Yes," I breathed. "My cabin neighbor, Lisa, whom I remembered, and she turned to face me with wide eyes. She said that my husband had gone to get ice last night and never returned when I asked at guest services. They informed me that he had been taken to the infirmary with severe seasickness, but when I went to see how he was doing, they refused to let me in, saying that it was quarantined because of a potential norovirus outbreak." Lisa shook her head slowly, and "I'm not sure what to believe anymore, but I know that something is wrong on this ship because," as if on cue, a scream pierced the night air, and Lisa and I both jumped, spinning toward the sound, which had come from the deck below us. We hurried to the stairs, our hearts racing, and made it to the lower deck. Noticed a small group of people gathered close to the ship's railing, and as we made it to the front, we saw a crew member dragging a young woman, possibly in her early 20s, back over the railing. She was crying uncontrollably and screaming, "Let me go," as the crowd murmured uneasily. An older man wearing a ship's officer uniform pushed through right away, taking command of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your cabins," he said. As they led the still struggling woman away, I caught her eye. There was no sign of intoxication, just raw primal fear. Lisa gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Did you hear her whisper? They're not human?" What did she mean? I shook my head, unable to form words, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what we just witnessed, the missing passengers, the crew's strange behavior, and now this? Brooking's voice was calm, but there was no argument. "Brooking?" As the crowd gradually dispersed, Lisa and I stayed put. The lovely night suddenly felt sinister, and the ship's gentle rocking became menacing rather than soothing. Lisa asked in a trembling voice, and I took a deep breath to calm myself. "Whatever is happening on this ship, we need to uncover it before we disappear too," I said, surprised by the determination in my own voice. As we headed back to our cabins to plan our next course of action, I had always known in some abstract way that the forest had eyes, but as I stood there surrounded by old trees and an unearthly silence, I felt something in my bones watching me. And it was hard to shake the feeling that we had just crossed a line. The carefree vacation was over, and we were now in uncharted waters, sailing into a mystery deeper and darker than the ocean beneath us. A tiny voice whispered a terrifying question somewhere in the back of my mind, asking whether we would ever make it back to shore to tell anyone the truth. I'm Jack Harper, and I've been hiking for the majority of my 35 years. I've tackled some of the most difficult trails in the country, from the Appalachian Trail to the Pacific Crest, but nothing in my experience had prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Cascade Mountains that fateful autumn day. It began as a routine solo hike, and I had planned a 3-day trek through a remote area with the intention of testing a new ultra. As the sun began to set, I found a small clearing to set up camp that night. As I lay in my tent listening to the familiar sounds of the forest, I felt completely at peace. The trouble started on the second day when I broke camp early, eager to get moving while the morning mist still clung to the trees and the trail began to clear. I had been assembling my light gear, and the weather was perfect, clear and crisp, with a hint of winter approaching. It was around midday when I first noticed the markings, and at first I thought it was just an odd pattern in the bark of one of the trees, but as I looked closer I realized it was definitely man-made. A series of intricate symbols had been carved into the trunk, and the cut was still fresh enough. The trees here were old, really old, their massive trunks covered in thick moss and their branches twisted in ways that sometimes made them look almost human. Vandalism on the trail always annoyed me, but this time it was different. The symbols weren't the typical graffiti or initials you occasionally see. Instead, they were intricate, almost like some kind of writing system I had never seen before. As I continued up the trail, I noticed more of the symbols. They were always carved into the largest, oldest trees, and each time I learned who had done this and why. It was late afternoon when I pulled out my map and compass to try to orient myself. But something was off. The compass needle spun languidly, refusing to settle on a direction. I shook and tapped it, but nothing helped, and a tendril of fear started to curl in my stomach. I had never had my compass fail on me before, so I reached for my phone, hoping to find my bearings after realizing I was lost and that I hadn't been paying close attention to the trail because I had been so preoccupied with the strange symbols that I hadn't been paying close attention to the trail. Used the GPS, but there was no signal. The light was naturally fading and the shadows were growing longer around me. I knew I needed to find a place to camp for the night, but I also told myself that I would be able to find the trail again in the morning. I chose a path that seemed promising and began to walk when I noticed the silence, which was unlike anything I had ever experienced in all my years of hiking. There were no bird calls, no small animals rustling in the underbrush, and the wind seemed to have died, leaving the forest in a spooky stillness. The trees appeared to be pressing closer together, their branches occasionally extending like twisted hands, and just as I was ready to give up and set up camp wherever I was, I staggered into a tiny clearing in the middle of which stood a huge tree. Possibly the largest I had ever seen, with its trunk covered in more symbols than I had ever seen before. However, it was the door embedded in the tree's trunk that stopped me cold, not the symbols. I was walking slowly, my heart thumping in my chest, when I noticed a wooden door that was ornately carved with the same symbols that I had been seeing all day. The wood was weathered and stained, but it was unquestionably a door. I reached out, half expecting my hand to pass right through it, but instead my fingers touched solid wood. I'm not sure what drove me to do this. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps there was some outside force directing my actions, but before I could, though, my instinct told me to run as far away from this impossibly difficult door as possible. Something held me in place. A whisper so faint that I wasn't sure if I was actually hearing it or just imagining it called my name, Jack. I took a step back and finally broke through the door, which opened with a low creak that seemed to echo through the silent forest. Beyond it was darkness, a blackness so complete that it seemed to swallow the light. My breath came in ragged gasps as I slammed the door shut, free of whatever spell had held me. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, I heard a low, rhythmic chanting that began softly and gradually became louder. I spun around, trying to find the source of the sound, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The chanting became louder and more insistent, repeating words in a language I didn't recognize, and beneath it all, I could still hear my name whispered like a threat or a promise. No matter how far or how quickly I ran, branches whipped at my face and roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I continued running because I was so terrified by a fear more primal than anything I had ever experienced. I don't know how long I ran, but time seemed to lose all meaning in that dark, twisted forest, and eventually my legs gave out. Panic overtook me as I crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about finding the trail or protecting the environment. As I lay there trying to catch my breath, I realized that the chanting had stopped. The forest was silent again, but this time it wasn't the strange silence from before. I could hear the wind in the trees and the distant owl's call. I forced myself to look around the trees, which appeared normal. There were no twisted branches or carved symbols, but as I stood there, something crunched beneath my foot and I felt my blood run cold. Half buried in the leaves was with trembling hands, I picked up the small wooden token with one of the symbols I'd seen on the trees carved into its surface. I needed evidence that I hadn't gone insane out here in the wilderness. The sky was lightening and the first hints of dawn were peeking through the canopy. I'd been running all night in the growing light when I spotted a trail marker. Somehow, I'd found my way back to the main trail without pausing to rest, ignoring the protests of my battered. It took me the majority of the day to get back to civilization and a world that made sense, so I started down the trail as quickly as I could. When I finally arrived at the trailhead where I had parked my car, I drove away with my hand shaking on the steering wheel because I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I had run into something dangerous and ancient that wasn't meant for human eyes. I've been home for a week now, trying to make sense of what happened, and I've looked into the symbols and consulted linguists and historians, but I didn't find anything. The wooden token on my desk serves as a constant reminder that it wasn't all in my head, but occasionally late at night I swear I can hear it whispering my name, and in my dreams I see that door standing open in the middle of the forest, waiting for me to enter. I know I should put it behind me, write it off as an inexplicable experience, and move on, but I can't. The mystery of what's behind that door consumes my thoughts, and deep down in a place I'm hardly willing to admit, I know I'll return. The first rays of dawn crept over the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across our campsite as the light touched our shredded tent and scattered supplies. The full extent of the night's destruction became clear, but it wasn't the destruction that chilled me to the bone. Calling, and sooner or later I'll have to answer, because the truth is I left something in those woods that is more important than any gear or supplies, a piece of myself. I have a feeling the forest won't rest until I come to reclaim it. My name is Mike Sullivan, and what began as a weekend camping trip with my best friend Dave had turned into something straight out of a nightmare. We had been planning this trip for months, eager to get away from the grind of our corporate jobs and reconnect with nature. We were both experienced campers, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered in the remote area. Bone was the massive, unidentifiable footprints leading away from our camp. Whatever had visited us in the night was still out there, and we were about to follow its trail. As we set up our tent, Dave said, "No emails, no deadlines, just us and the great outdoors." I nodded in agreement, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. "It's perfect. Let's get a fire going and crack. Wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, we arrived at the trailhead on Friday afternoon, our packs full of enough supplies for 3 days. The hiking was challenging but exhilarating, and by the time we reached our intended campsite, a small clearing near a bubbling stream, we were exhausted, but man, I needed this, Dave said. As we settled into our sleeping bags, the forest surrounding us came alive with nocturnal sounds. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush and the hoot of an owl were calming, and I fell asleep feeling more at ease than I had in months. I'm not sure what woke me up. Perhaps it was a sudden silence, the absence of anyone or anything else. The evening went by nicely. We grilled hot dogs over the fire, told stories, and marveled at the blanket of stars overhead. Those sounds of the night, or perhaps it was some primal instinct detecting a predator close by, whatever it was, I woke up in the complete darkness of our tent, Dave. I whispered, reaching out to shake his shoulder, and he woke up complaining, "What time is it?" I hissed, and we both fell silent, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing, but then we heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite. They were slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was looking for something. Dave's hand found mine in the dark, squeezing suddenly. A low growl vibrated through the air, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. It was deeper, almost guttural, and it radiated a terrifying intelligence. Without warning, our tent was torn away, the poles snapping like twigs, and Dave and I scrambled out of our tent. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent, and I could hear deep rumbling breaths like a large animal sending the air. I caught a glimpse of our attacker, who was enormous, approximately 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur, but it wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. Its proportions were all wrong, too humanoid, and its eyes gleamed with an unnatural intelligence. I screamed, grabbing Dave's arm and dragging him towards the trees as we crashed through the underbrush, blinded with terror. Behind us, I could hear the creature giving chase as we ran until our legs felt like jelly and our lungs burned, and then we collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for air. "What was that thing?" Dave panted. I shook my head, unable to form words, my mind reeling from trying to make sense of what we'd seen. We huddled there for what seemed like hours, jumping at every sound, but the creature, whatever it was, didn't seem to have followed us. As the sky lightened, we cautiously returned to our campsite, and the scene that met us was Dave and I exchanged the same thought. We should leave, we should get the hell out of these mountains and never look back, but our curiosity, that damnable human trait, took over our fear, and we decided to follow them. Our tent was in tatters, our supplies were scattered everywhere, and deep claw marks scored the nearby trees. And there in the soft earth were the enormous footprints with 5 distinct toes, which were unmistakably hominid in shape. As we hiked, the forest around us seemed to change as the trees grew larger and older, their branches twisting in all directions. I wanted to argue quietly that we should return to civilization, but there was a part of me that I wasn't completely comfortable acknowledging that wanted to know more. So we gathered what supplies we could salvage and set off following the trail of massive footprints. The tracks led us deeper into the forest, up steep inclines and through dense underbrush, whatever had made them strong, pushing through areas that gave us significant trouble. Unnaturally, the underbrush grew thicker and was dotted with plants that I didn't recognize. Mike Dave called out, his voice tight with tension, and as he pointed to one of the trees, he pointed out a strange symbol carved into its bark. It was a complicated swirl of lines that hurt my eyes if I stared at it for too long. I asked, reaching out to touch the carving, and Dave shook his head. I'm not sure, but I noticed that it was on other trees as well. As the day wore on, exhaustion set in. We had been hiking for hours without seeing our quarry, and just as I was about to suggest that we turn back, we emerged into a clearing in the middle of which stood an enormous tree, easily the largest I had ever seen, its trunk covered in those strange symbols carved on it. The air grew thick and heavy, and there was an unnatural silence over everything. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as if we had entered a different world entirely. There was a cave-like opening at the base, partially hidden by gnarled roots. Dave and I looked at each other, and the footprints led straight into the dark opening. Dave's voice was barely above a whisper, and every instinct told me to run as far away from this place as possible. But I found myself nodding and being drawn forward by an inexplicable curiosity. We turned on our flashlights and entered the cave, where the air was cool and damp and had a strange, musky smell. As I was beginning to fear that we would become lost, we emerged into a large cavern. Our flashlights couldn't reach the entire length of the space, but what they showed made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in crude paintings that showed enormous fur-covered figures alongside much smaller human figures. Our lights revealed rough stone walls covered in more of those strange symbols that were painted rather than carved. We moved deeper into the cave, our footsteps echoing softly. Shapes, hunts, and rituals were depicted in some scenes. But what really frightened me was the rudimentary altar of piled stones that were darkly stained with what I hoped was not blood. Carefully placed around it were human skulls, and I choked out, grabbing Dave's arm. He nodded, his face pale in the flashlight beam, and we turned to leave, only to discover that our exit was blocked. The creature from our campsite stood there, its massive form filling the tunnel in the light of hour for the first time. I was able to see it clearly thanks to flashlights. It was a strange combination of man and beast, covered in thick, matted fur, with a face that was almost but not quite human and eyes that were brimming with intelligence. It stared at us for a while before making a low, rumbling sound, and to my surprise, I realized it was trying to speak. "You come?" it growled, and Dave and I exchanged horrified and amazed looks. We had come seeking answers, and as we followed the creature deeper into the cave system, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we had crossed a threshold. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. We had entered the realm of something ancient and unknown, and we were confronted with something beyond our wildest expectations. The creature turned, gesturing for us to follow, and despite every logical thought telling me to run, I found myself taking a step forward because I realized we were on the verge of a discovery that would change everything. Our weekend camping trip had long since been forgotten, but now we were embarking on a journey into the heart of a mystery that would challenge everything we believed we knew about the world and our place in it. As the darkness of the cave engulfed us, I couldn't help but wonder, Were we discoverers on the verge of a groundbreaking discovery? Or were we being led deeper into a predator's lair? Only time would tell, and I feared that the answers might come at a cost greater than we were willing to pay. My name is Joe Hawkins, and I have been driving big rigs across the country since I was old enough to obtain my commercial license. I thought that the next few hours would be the longest and most terrifying of my 15-year career as a long-haul trucker. I thought that the endless ribbon of asphalt stretched out before me, disappearing into the inky darkness of the desert night. My headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating nothing but empty roads and the occasional scrub brush. You don't travel at midnight without hearing a few stories about strange things that happen on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on Route 50 in Nevada. It began at around 2 in the morning. I had been running from Salt Lake City to Sacramento for about 6 hours, making good time. The only noise in the cab of my Peterbilt was the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. I was getting into that zen-like state that long-distance drivers are familiar with, where they are not quite asleep but also not completely awake. When I first saw the headlights in my rearview mirror, I didn't think much of it because other cars aren't unusual even at this hour. However, as the minutes passed, I realized something wasn't quite right because the car behind me was keeping pace precisely the same distance no matter how I changed my speed. I clicked on my CB, thinking maybe it was another trucker playing games, and breaker 1 is lone wolf. I don't even know if anyone else is following me over silence. As the next hour crawled by, the car remained fixed behind me. I tried speeding up, slowing down, and even pulling over at a rest stop, but each time the mysterious vehicle perfectly mirrored my actions. I'd hop to get a look at who was driving, but the car stopped just out of sight in the darkness beyond the static. I scowled and checked my mirrors again, but the headlights were still there, unwavering, probably just some tourist who's nervous about passing a big rig in the dark. I tried the CB again, this time on multiple channels, but all I got was dead air. That's when things got really strange, because we were traveling through a particularly barren area of the desert when all of a sudden the headlights behind me winked out. I thought maybe whoever it was had finally turned off, but then, to my horror, it was right behind me again as soon as I pulled back onto the highway. By this point, my palms were sweating on the steering wheel. With my heart racing, I looked over to try to get a glimpse of the driver when I noticed headlights appear in my side mirror. The car was now driving alongside my truck at a perfect pace, and the windows were so darkly tinted that they resembled black mirrors reflecting the starry desert sky. I yelled, "What the hell do you want?" knowing they couldn't hear me, but I couldn't keep quiet any longer. As if in response, the car suddenly accelerated and pulled in front of my truck for the first time. I got a good look at it, and it was an old model, possibly from the 1970s, with sleek lines that didn't exactly match any make or model I could remember, and it was black. Not just dark, but so deep that it seemed to swallow the light from my headlights. Now that I was getting really scared, I reached for the CV mic once more. "Mayday, mayday, this is truck driver Joe Hawkins on Route 50, mile marker 257. I have a vehicle harassing me. Does anyone copy the radio?" It crackled to life, and for a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief, but what came through was a response. Although the strange broadcast continued for a few seconds before cutting off abruptly. In the silence that followed, I became acutely aware of a new sound, a high-pitched whine, coming from the black car in front of me. As I watched in disbelief, the back of the car started to change. It seemed as though the metal was flowing and reshaping itself. What appeared to be a mechanical arm reaching back towards my truck. "Oh hell no," I yelled, finally breaking out of my stunned state. For a moment, everything seemed to ripple and shift in the light of my headlights as I slammed on the brakes, causing the tires to screech in protest as I brought 40 tons of steel to a rapid halt. The black car then shot forward, its strange appendage grasping at empty air, where my truck had been moments before it skidded to a stop about 100 yards ahead. I sat there with my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, staring at the motionless vehicle in front of me, my mind reeling, unable to process what I just witnessed. Slowly, the eye felt the last remnants of rational explanation disappear as the driver's door of the black car opened and a figure appeared. It was humanoid in shape, but too tall and thin to be human. Its movements were fluid but somehow incorrect, like a marionette under the control of an inexperienced puppeteer. As it turned to face me, I caught a glimpse of its face, or rather, where a face should have been. There were no features, just a smooth, reflective surface like polished obsidian. I didn't choose to act. Instinct took over. I threw my truck I shifted back into drive and swerved around, thinking that whatever gods might be listening, because the highway was empty. I floored it, pushing my rig to speeds it was never intended for, and I could see the black car pursuing me with unfathomable speed in my mirrors. My CB crackled to life again, that weird humming and alien speech pouring out of the speakers, and I tore the microphone from its cradle. The reverse tires spun as I backed away as quickly as I dared, and the figure started to approach me. Threw it on the ground, but the sound persisted and seemed to come from both everywhere and nowhere. Suddenly, the black car was directly behind me, and I could see the mechanical arm reaching out once more, grasping for my trailer. My speedometer was buried and the engine was screaming in protest, but it wasn't enough because, just when I thought I was done, I saw something ahead that gave me enormous hope: the lights of a town. I had completely lost track of my location, but at that moment, I didn't care what civilization meant to people, so I laid on the horn as I slammed on the brakes, and my truck slid to a stop in front of what appeared to be a small diner. A few shocked customers peered out the windows at the commotion for a long time, and I just sat there, gasping for air, waiting for the black car to reappear, but it didn't come. The street behind me was empty and quiet except for the ticking of my cooling system. I drove into the outskirts of the small desert town, praying that someone would notice what was happening as I screeched around a corner. I climbed down from the cab on wobbly legs. A few people had emerged from the diner, looking worried. One of them asked, "You came in here like a bat out of hell?" I opened my mouth to explain, but I wondered where to start and who would believe me. I thought something was wrong with my brakes, so I lied. I apologized for the scare, and as the small crowd dispersed, their curiosity was satiated. I leaned against my truck, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a hallucination? Nightmare caused by too many hours of driving? But then I noticed it on the side of my trailer, exactly where that mechanical arm had been reaching, and it was a perfect handprint, not a human handprint, but something with too many fingers pressed so deeply into the metal that it appeared to have been made of soft clay. I stared at it, my mind reeling, knowing that whatever had been chasing me out there in the desert night was real, and somehow I knew with terrifying certainty that it wasn't. Finished with me, I climbed back into my taxi, my hands still shaking, and silently vowed to find answers no matter where that search took me. My sanctuary had turned into a place of terror, and as I left that small town and headed towards the approaching dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching and waiting for unsuspecting travelers like me. The lonely highways I'd traveled for years were no longer just empty stretches of asphalt, they were hunting grounds. I lowered my camera, squinting at the LCD screen to show you the shot, feeling that my nightmare was just getting started. The shutter clicked, freezing the moment in digital eternity. My heart raced as I zoomed in on the pixelated image, which resolved into a shape that defied explanation. The moment I saw it, I knew my life would never be the same. My name is Alex Chin, and up until that point, I was just another wildlife photographer. It all began 3 days ago. I had heard rumors of unusually large wolf packs in this area, and I was determined to get the shot that would cement my reputation in the wildlife photography world. I had hiked deep into the wilderness in pursuit of the perfect shot at the age of 32. I had developed a respectable reputation taking pictures of North America's more elusive creatures, such as wolves in Yellowstone Mountain, lions in the Rockies, bears in Alaska, and wolves in Yellowstone. The first 2 days were frustrating but uneventful. I had seen tracks of wolf activity and the remains of a deer carcass, but no actual wolves. As the sun set on the 3rd day, I was beginning to think that this trip might not work out, but then I heard a howl that reverberated through the forest, sending a shiver down my spine. There was something wrong about it, too deep, too human, but I was too excited to pay much attention to my uneasiness, so I grabbed my camera and headed. The forest around me seemed to change as I crept forward, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. The trees grew older, and their branches twisted in ways that seemed almost intentional, and the undergrowth became denser with plants I didn't recognize. An unnatural silence was broken only by the occasional snapping twig beneath my feet. Then I saw a clearing ahead, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and there at the far edge was a massive dark shape that made my heart leap. Could it be a wolf? I lifted my camera and zoomed in as far as my lens would allow through the viewfinder, allowing me to see the creature more clearly. It was covered in dark fur, but its proportions were incorrect for a wolf. It stood on 2 legs and was easily 7 or 8 feet tall. My finger hesitated over the shutter button, wondering if I was looking at a bear, but even as I thought that, I knew that wasn't right because its shape was too humanoid and its movements were too deliberate before I could catch a glimpse of it. I pushed the button and the shutter clicked strangely loudly out in the silent forest. The creature's head snapped around and I found myself looking into eyes that were definitely not animal. They gleamed with an intelligence that made me shiver for a long time. We locked eyes, neither of us moving, and then it vanished into the trees at a speed that belied its size. I stood there frozen, my camera hanging limply from my hand, wondering what I had just seen. The photo on my camera's screen showed a large, fur-covered figure with its face turned towards me. The image was a little blurry because of the low light and the creature's sudden movement, but it was clear enough to see that this was something unknown to science as the implications of what I captured began to sink in. This could be the discovery of the century, my friend. It was more bizarre than the last Bigfoot, some undiscovered species of primate, or a hoax with shaking hands. Name would be remembered, but a tiny voice in the back of my mind warned me that there might be a reason this creature had stayed hidden for so long. I hardly slept that night, and my dreams were full of glowing eyes and shadowy figures. As soon as the first rays of dawn appeared through the trees, I was up and looked at the picture once more. In the harsh daylight, doubt started to creep in. Could I have thought it was a bear or some other well-known animal? But no, the picture was unquestionable evidence that using all the skills I'd developed over years of wildlife photography, I spent the day tracking after seeing something extraordinary. The signs were subtle, like a bent branch here or an unusually large footprint there, and as the day went on, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was the one being watched. I packed up my camp and decided I needed to find it again to get clearer photos, maybe even some video, because the world needed to know about this. The trees grew denser and darker, their branches tangled to block out most of the sunlight. I checked my GPS and frowned at the screen, and it showed that I was miles away from where I had thought I was, in a section of the forest that didn't match any of my maps. Just as I was about to turn around, I heard the same deep, almost human howl from the previous night, but this time it was much closer, and my heart raced as I pushed through a dense patch of ferns and found myself. Another clearing, but this one was different, had stone monoliths standing in a rough circle, each covered in strange swirling symbols that seemed to change if I stared at them for too long. In the middle of the circle was the creature, which had thick dark fur and a face that was almost human but had a pronounced brow and a mouth full of sharp teeth. I could clearly see it in the full light of day, and I felt a sudden sense of recognition. As the creature approached me, I should have fled in fear, but something held me in place. This being of wisdom beyond human comprehension raised a hand, not a paw, but a hand with opposable thumbs, and pointed at my camera, making it obvious that it wanted me to take a picture of it with trembling hands. I raised my camera and started shooting the creature as it posed, turning this way and that, revealing itself from all sides. Angles, it felt like the most bizarre photo shoot of my life. As I lowered the camera, the creature nodded as if satisfied, then it started to change, shimmering like heat haze on a hot road. Suddenly, I was staring at myself, a perfect replica, right down to the mud on my boots and the scratch on my left hand from a thorn bush. I staggered back, my mind reeling. The other me grinned, but it was too big because I knew it spoke, and even though the voice was mine, the words were unlike anything I had ever heard in an ancient. And as the alien spoke, the symbols on the stone monoliths started to glow and pulse in time with its words. I felt dizzy and thought I was going to fall, but the clearing seemed to spin and the trees blurred into a green whirlwind. I woke up with a start and my head pounding, and I was back in my tent with my camera by my side. For a brief moment, I thought it had all been a vivid dream, but when I checked my camera, I saw the blurry shot from the first night and the unthinkable images from as I looked at the pictures. I felt a chill go down my spine because every time the creature was facing the camera, I recognized the face down to the tiny scar on my chin from a childhood accident, and wondered what I had found, what the stone circle meant, the strange symbols, and, most unsettlingly, how this creature and I were related. I packed up my belongings with trembling hands and my mind racing because I knew I should notify the authorities and the world about what I had found. Change everything we believed we knew about evolution and the history of our planet. But as I lifted my backpack, a strange certainty descended upon me. This wasn't for the world to know yet. There were powerful and ancient secrets here that weren't meant for human comprehension. As I left the forest, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was leaving a piece of myself behind, or maybe I was taking something with me, something ancient, wild, and unknown. But one thing was certain, my life as I knew it was abruptly over. The creature that was wearing my face seemed larger, stranger, and full of possibilities and dangers I had never thought of. It was a creature that held the answers to questions I was only starting to formulate, and my journey wasn't ending, it was just getting started. For a brief moment, the sound of laughter pierced the night's silence, jolting me awake. I smiled, thinking my daughter had sneaked out of bed to play, but reality struck me cold when I realized two terrifying facts. The laughter wasn't my child's, and it came from within. After my divorce, we had moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood 6 months ago in the hopes of starting over. Up until tonight, our biggest concern had been adjusting to our new life. However, as I lay frozen in my bed and listened to the eerie laughter reverberating throughout our home, I realized how foolish I had been to believe we were safe. My name is Sarah Anderson, and I am a single mother to my 5-year-old daughter, Lily. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. The witching hour, as my grandmother used to call it, was a time when I felt a primal fear that defied reason. The laughter came closer this time, sounding like a child's voice but warped as if it were coming from an old record player. My maternal instincts finally overcame my paralysis and I had to check on Lily. I slipped out of bed, barefoot, and walked silently on the cold hardwood floor. The hallway loomed ahead of me, dark and menacing. I thought about turning on a light but decided against it if there was an. I paused outside Lily's room, my hand on the doorknob, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over Lily's bed, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw it was empty, the covers thrown back. Where was she, Lily? I whispered, barely audible even to my own ears. Sweetie, where are you? No response, and I moved further into the hallway, not wanting to draw their attention to myself. I was checking the room under the bed and in the closet when I heard the sound of a floorboard coming from downstairs. My heart was racing as I walked to the top of the stairs, which led to the ground floor, which was dark, but I could see a faint glow coming from the living room. I went down the stairs slowly, flinching at every little sound, and when I got to the bottom, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. The front door was wide open, allowing the cool night air to enter the living room. I looked around the corner and felt my heart stop there. Lily was sitting in the middle of the room, cross-legged on the floor with her back to me and still wearing her favorite unicorn pajamas. The glow I'd seen was coming from Lily's favorite nightlight, the one shaped like a fairy that usually stayed in her room. What was it doing down here? I approached the living room entrance, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to leave the house, and to call for help, but I couldn't leave without Lily. I watched in horror and disbelief as Lily giggled. It was her laugh, the one I'd heard from my bedroom, but it sounded wrong somehow, too old to know for my little girl. In the dim light, I could only make out a vague shape sitting across from her. It seemed to be about Lily's size, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too large, and it was misshapen. They seemed to be playing some sort of game, moving small objects between them. The sound that woke me up was a terrible parody of Lily's laugh, and I realized that I must have made a noise like a gasp or a whimper because both Lily and the thing turned to face me at once. Lily's face was blank, her eyes unfocused, as if she were sleepwalking, but the other's face was clearly visible for the first time in the dim glow of the nightlight. It resembled a child's rudimentary attempt to create a human face out of clay, with all of its features, eyes, nose, and mouth, but the eyes were two big, solid black orbs. Its mouth was stretched in a wide, toothy grin that split its face almost in half, and its nose was just two gaping holes. "Mommy," Lily said in a flat, emotionless voice, "come play with us." The thing nodded, its enormous head bobbing unnaturally, and its grin impossibly grew even wider. "Yes, Mommy," it said in a perfect imitation of Lily's voice. I stood there in complete terror, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. It couldn't be real, I had to be dreaming. Door on my skin, the smell of wet earth from the muddy footprints, the gentle glow of the night light. It was all too vivid and present to be a dream, Lily. I choked out, "Come here, baby, come to Mommy." Lily didn't move, instead, she just stared at me with those blank eyes. The thing started to rise, unfolding its limbs to impossible lengths until it loomed over me, saying, still, in Lily's voice. This thing, whatever it was threatening my child's dream or nightmare. I sprang forward with the intention of grabbing Lily and running away from our impossible reality, but as soon as I stepped into the room, the nightlight went out, leaving us in complete darkness. I heard Lily scream, and the sound of sheer terror sliced through me like a knife. I yelled, reaching out blindly in the dark, and my hands touched something cold and wet that wriggled under my grasp. I recoiled and fell backwards, and then the room's lights suddenly came on. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my eyes struggling to adjust. I looked around frantically, but everything was gone. Muddy footprints, the open front door, as if the last few minutes had never happened. I hurried to Lily, scooping her up in my arms and holding her tight. She felt real solid, her small body warm against mine, and I breathed in her familiar scent. As my vision cleared, I saw Lily standing by the light switch, her hands still raised. She looked confused, as if she had just woken up. "Mommy," she said in a small, scared voice, "what's happening? Why are we downstairs?" I carried Lily back up to her room, my eyes darting to every shadow and dark corner as I tucked her into bed. I told myself, "It's okay, baby," and she told me, "Everything's okay, you were just sleepwalking." However, even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true because the image of that thing, with its distorted face and impossible grin, was burned into my memory. I could also feel its laugh and feel its cold, damp skin under my hands. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, I decided we couldn't stay here, no matter what. Mommy whispered, "Who was that boy I was playing with?" Lily yawned, her eyes already drooping with sleep, and the funny-looking boy said he wanted to be my friend. He said he'd come back to play again. I sat there stroking her hair until she fell asleep, my mind reeling from what had happened tonight, what had happened, why it had come for Lily, and most importantly, would it return? I started packing, throwing clothes and necessities into suitcases, and we were going to leave as soon as Lily woke up. I had no idea where we were going, but anywhere had to be safer than here. As I closed the last suitcase, I briefly noticed movement in the mirror, that wide, unnatural grin, and those black eyes staring at me from the reflection. I spun around, my heart pounding, but nothing was there, so I turned back to the mirror and stared at my own pale, terrified face. Back at me, but as I saw my reflection's lips curl into a grin that wasn't mine, it said, "See you soon, Mommy," in Lily's voice. The mirror then cracked, revealing a web of fractures radiating from the center. I staggered back, a scream catching in my throat, realizing that whatever had entered our house the night before wasn't done with us. It was only the start of a nightmare that I thought would never end. The only light in the office was the glow from my computer screen. I was supposed to be alone up here, but as I hit send on my last email, I heard the unmistakable sound of the elevator arriving on our floor. My name is Rachel Chin, and I'm a 28-year-old marketing executive at Pinnacle Advertising. I had been working through the night to finish a crucial presentation for a new client, so it wasn't unusual for me to be the last person in the office, but it still made me feel accomplished. It seemed different tonight. The quiet of the deserted building had been reassuring until the elevator sounded, and at 11:47 p.m., I checked my watch. For a moment, I thought about calling out to ask who was there, but something in my lizard brain told me to keep quiet, to hide. I slowly got up, trying not to let my chair creak, and immediately felt exposed because the cleaning crew had left hours ago and security had completed their rounds on the hour. I needed to find a better way to hide. Vantage Point was a place where I could see without being noticed as quietly as possible. I went to the break room, which had a clear view of the elevator bank, but the lights were off, so I had some cover. I stood behind the door, looking through the crack, and the elevator doors opened with a soft whoosh. I held my breath, waiting to see who would get out, but nobody did. The elevator car sat there, empty, and lit up a bright rectangle in the dim hallway. I scowled, wondering if someone had unintentionally pressed the button for our floor. The doors closed once more as I watched the elevator's lights flicker twice before going out entirely. The elevator was now a dark void with a mouth open in the wall. This wasn't right. I should have left, descended the stairs, and left the building, but my curiosity, that damned human trait, kept me frozen in place. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkened elevator, and in the dim office light, I could only make out a silhouette because it was tall and strangely so. The figure stood motionless for a moment, seemingly orienting itself, but then, with a fluid motion that made my stomach turn, it turned its head. I couldn't see its face, but I felt with a certainty that defied logic that it was looking directly at me. I ducked back, pressing myself against the wall, my heart thumping so hard that I was certain it could hear it. I closed my eyes, silently praying that when I opened them it would hear it. All of this could be a dream or hallucination caused by too much caffeine and not enough sleep, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. For a brief moment, relief came over me, but then a new, more terrifying thought came to me. If it wasn't in the hallway, where was it? As if in response, I heard footsteps coming from the main office area, but they weren't like any I'd heard before. They were too light and moving too quickly for something that size. I had to leave now, so I looked toward the stairwell door. I might make it if I ran 30 feet away, past multiple rows of desks, but the logical part of my brain, which was not consumed by terror, knew that running would create noise and that people would hear me, so I moved slowly, carefully, and silently. I had made it about halfway to the door when the footsteps stopped and the silence that followed was deafening. I stood frozen, terrified that even breathing too loudly would give me away when I heard a soft sound like someone slowly inhaling, and it was too close, so I turned my head in agony. The figure was standing at the end of the line of desks, not 10 feet away, and I could finally see its face, or rather where its face should have been, in the light from a forgotten computer monitor. The head was smooth and featureless, like an egg made of shadow, but as I watched in horror, the surface started to ripple, and as I watched, not two, but dozens of eyes opened, blinking in unsynchronized patterns. A mouth formed, stretching impossibly wide, full of teeth that looked razor-sharp. "Rachel," it said in a voice that sounded like 100. "We've been waiting for you." Whispers layered over each other, and I forgot all about stealth as I ran for the stairwell door. Just behind me, I heard a sound like tearing fabric, followed by fast footsteps, and I hit the door at full speed, almost falling down the stairs in my haste. I took them 3 at a time, and the sound of my pursuer echoed in the 27-story stairwell for what seemed like an eternity. My legs hurt, but I kept moving out of the stairwell and into the lobby. I screamed, not slowing down, and headed for the main doors, startling the night security guard to call the police. I heard the guard shout something, but I didn't pause to listen. I ran out into the street, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. Only after I had run a few blocks did I dare to look back, because the street behind me was deserted and there was no sign of the elevator. I slowed to a stop, gasping for air, my mind reeling, wondering what had just happened and what that thing was, and as my breathing steadied, doubts started to creep in. The Pinnacle advertising building's upper floors were lost in the night sky as I watched lights flicker on floor by floor, beginning in the lobby and working their way up. The night security guard must have been inspecting the building at the time, because just as the lights reached the 27th floor, they all went out and the entire building went dark for a long time. Then, one by one, the lights on each floor started to come back on, but this time they started from I watched in horror as the lights went down on the 26th floor, 25th floor, 24th floor, and whatever was up there was making its way down. A car horn blared, waking me up, and I turned and ran, not caring where I was going as long as it was out of my day. As I ran, my phone buzzed in my pocket and I took it out with shaking hands. It was a text message from an unknown number. "See you tomorrow, Rachel. Don't be late." I almost dropped the phone, but I knew with a sickening certainty that I would return tomorrow, because whatever I ran through the night wondering what the creature was, why it was there, and most terrifyingly, what it wanted with me. One thing was certain, though, my life had changed irrevocably. The comfortable reality I had known had been shattered, replaced by a world where monsters lurked in elevators and shadows had teeth. As I finally made it to my apartment building, fumbling with my keys, a new thought occurred to me. Could this thing be in my office? Could it be anywhere? I locked my door, checked it twice, and then sank to the floor with my back against the wall. Sleep was impossible because I knew deep down that this was just the beginning of whatever game this entity was playing, and I was now an unwilling participant. As the first rays of morning started to peek through my windows, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched somewhere. I froze, my flashlight beam fixed on the dusty hallway ahead, straining my ears for any sign that we'd been discovered, but after what seemed like an eternity, I took another step forward. Something was waiting in the shadows between floors, and whether I was ready or not, I would have to face it again tomorrow. The floorboard creaked beneath my foot, and my heart leaped into my throat in the oppressive silence of the abandoned mansion. That small sound felt like a gunshot. My name is Alex Reeves, and I'm what you might call an urban explorer, at least that's how I started out. These days, I'm not sure what to call myself, a fool, a thrill seeker with a death wish, or just someone who seemed too much to ever return to a normal life. It all began 3 months ago when my best friend Danny showed me a shaky recording of an old mansion on the outskirts of our city that he had found online. The location had been deserted for decades and had been the focus of innumerable local legends, but this video was unique because it featured lights moving in the windows, shadows that didn't match any sources, and, at the very end, a face in one of the upper windows that wasn't human. Danny was certain that it was elaborate special effects, a viral marketing gimmick for a new horror film, but I wasn't so sure because there was something about that face that made me shiver every time I watched it. Decided to check it out ourselves, Danny, our other friend Sarah, who had a well-known YouTube channel devoted to dispelling paranormal hoaxes, and we reasoned that, in the best case scenario, we would get some cool footage for her channel, and in the worst case, we would have a fun night exploring a creepy old house. We had no idea what we were actually walking into, but even from the outside, it was obvious that this place had once been grand. As evidenced by its peeling "No way, we came here for answers and we're gonna get them." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of dread in my stomach. Let's do this. Getting inside was easier than we anticipated. One of the ground floor windows had already been pried open, the boards covering it removed, and as we climbed through, the musty smell of decay hit us. Sarah whispered her camera was already rolling, and Danny smiled, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. The floor was covered in footprints, which were clearly visible in the thick layer of dust. Some of the footprints were normal shoe prints, but others looked like no footprint I'd ever seen before. As we moved deeper into the house, our flashlight beams pierced the darkness, and each room told a story of faded grandeur and long hours. Like a wall, God, it reeks in here, Danny muttered, pulling his shirt up over his nose. Sarah swept her camera around the room, and she was right. In one room, we discovered a circle of candles, the wax still soft as if they had just been lit. In another, strange symbols were carved into the floorboards, their edges clean and fresh against the weathered wood. Sarah said, "This is officially creepy," her usual skepticism faltering, and then we heard a thump from somewhere above us. The abandoned, moth-eaten curtains, furniture covered in sheets, and paintings on the walls so coated in grime that the subjects were unrecognizable. But there were other items that didn't fit. We all froze, staring at one another with wide eyes. Danny said, "Maybe it's just another explorer," in a voice that was barely above a whisper. But we all knew that couldn't be true because there hadn't been any other cars on the long, overgrown driveway leading to the mansion. Those footsteps didn't sound quite right. They were heavy and deliberate. "We should check it out," I said, surprised. Part of me wanted to run as far away from this place as possible, but a larger part of me wanted to the curiosity that had always driven me to explore deserted areas and seek out the unknown was burning as we ascended the grand staircase, its once plush carpet now threadbare beneath our feet. The upper floor was perhaps even more eerie than the ground floor. The hallway seemed to go on forever, with doors on both sides, and at the very end, a soft glow spilled out from beneath one of the doors, which is where we were headed. Now, as we crept down the hallway, every creak and groan of the old house made our nerves tense. We were only a few feet from the door when Sarah's camera beeped loudly, signaling a low battery. The voices inside the room immediately stopped for a moment. Everything was silent, and then the door began to open. "Run," I hissed, already turning back the way we'd come, and we ran down the hallway no more. As we got closer to the door, I could hear voices, but they were too low to understand and didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard before. The cadence was all wrong, rising and falling in patterns that made my head spin if I listened too closely. A figure stood at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the glow from the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and joined in all the wrong places, and its face, where its face should have been, was just a swirling void darker than the darkness surrounding it. I didn't care about the noise we were making behind us, but I heard something emerge from the room. Its footsteps were too fast, gaining on us with inhuman speed, and we flew down the stairs, 3 at a time. I glanced back and instantly wished I hadn't. Sarah went through first, then Danny, and as we got to the bottom of the stairs, I felt something cold brush against my ankle. I kicked out wildly and heard a hiss of pain that sounded almost human. Then I heard it coming down the stairs. We could hear it coming closer and closer as we ran for the window. Sarah tripped and fell to the ground, and Sarah and I each grabbed an arm to help him get to his feet, but we lost valuable seconds. Was through tumbling onto the overgrown lawn. We ran to the car, didn't stop until we were inside with the doors locked, and Danny gunned the engine. I caught a glimpse of the face from the video in one of the upper windows, but I realized it wasn't a face at all. Rather, it was a swirling mass of darkness that somehow radiated malevolence. We drove in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, until Sarah spoke into my camera, her voice trembling, and I dropped it when, as I sat there, still shaking from our narrow escape, I realized that proof didn't matter because we knew what we'd seen, and somehow I knew this wasn't over. In the days that followed, we tried to convince ourselves that it had all been some elaborate hoax prank taken too far, but deep down we knew the truth, that there were things in this world. We were running, and whatever footage she'd managed to capture of that thing was now lost. We never told anyone else about that night because it was impossible to explain the things that lurked in the shadows of deserted places, waiting for foolish explorers like us. However, occasionally late at night, I find myself drawn to the window and stare out into the darkness, and I can't get rid of the feeling that something is waiting and watching somewhere in that crumbling mansion on the outskirts of town. I know with a certainty that makes me shudder that I will have to return someday, because once as I sit here writing this, I can't help but wonder what I will find when I return to that mansion, and more terrifyingly, what will find me. The subway car came to an abrupt stop, and the fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows across the faces of my fellow passengers. I had a glimpse of what lies beyond the veil of our ordinary world. You can never truly look away from the darkness, and sooner or later you have to answer it. My name is Mia Chun, and until a week ago, I was just another face in the crowd of New York City. I'm a 28-year-old graphic designer who moved here from a small Midwest town chasing big dreams. Now, as I sit frozen in my seat, I wonder if those dreams will be the death of me. It began last Tuesday when I was on my usual morning commute, lost in thought about an empty car. The stranger who had been following me all week was here, his dark eyes locked on mine, and we were trapped underground with no way out. A man was staring at me intently as I got off the subway at my stop because I had an upcoming project deadline. He was unremarkable in appearance. Average height, dark hair, and unremarkable clothing. But something about his eyes made my skin crawl. I dismissed it, figuring it was just the usual strangeness of city life, but the following morning he was back. And the next time on my train, he was always watching me. I tried changing my route. I never saw him outside the subway, but every time I walked into a station, my heart would race until I finally spotted him. It was like a twisted game of hide and seek where I was always found. I had thought about calling the police, but what would I say when a man was using the same public transportation as me and he looked at me? I had no evidence that he had done anything wrong, just a nagging feeling of dread that grew every day. Brought me to tonight. I had stayed late at work in the hopes of avoiding my usual train, and when I got into the almost empty subway car, my heart sank when I saw that he was sitting calmly as if he had been waiting for me. I had sat as far away from him as I could, holding my phone to dial 911, and we had gone 2 stops in complete silence before the train screeched to a halt. Now, as the shadows danced around us, I watched in horror as he slowly got up, his movements fluid, almost graceful, and he approached me. He said, "Hello, Mia," in a surprisingly soft voice. "I think it's time we talked." My breath caught in my throat. How did he know my name? I hadn't spoken to him or even acknowledged his existence for a week. "Who are you?" I managed to croak out my finger hovering over the call button on my phone. "What do you want from me?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, which remained cold. "Calculating who I am isn't important. What's important is who you are, Mia." The cold metal of the subway seat beneath me, the AC smell of the tunnel outside, and the very real man standing in front of me were all too vivid to be a dream. "I don't understand," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. He sat down opposite me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Of course you don't yet, but you will see, Mia, you're special." Instead, a hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. I would wake up in my bed. This couldn't be happening any moment now. "We've been watching you for a long time, and we know what you're capable of." I looked around the car and was suddenly certain that the other passengers were in on it, thinking that this was some elaborate setup, but they remained as uninterested as before. "Yes," he confirmed, "that there are more of us than you can imagine, Mia." I shook my head in confusion and fear, saying, "I'm not special, I'm nobody. Just leave me alone, please, for millennia, and now it's your turn to join us." I got up quickly, not caring if I looked crazy to the other passengers. "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't want to just stay away from me." I moved to push past him, planning to beat on the driver's compartment door if I had to, but as I did, his hand shot out, gripping my wrist with unnatural strength. "You don't have a choice, me," he said, his voice still calm but with a steely edge underneath. "The process has already started. Haven't you noticed the as if reading my mind?" he said. "Maybe you were, but you need guidance training. Without us you'll lose control, and trust me, you don't want that to happen." I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron, and even as I said it, I knew what he meant. The headaches I'd been having all week, the strange dreams, the moments when I swore I could hear other people's thoughts. The complex systems of the subway car laid themselves out before me like a 3D blueprint, and the man holding my wrist revealed to me that he was not human at all. I recoiled, yanking my arm free with strength I didn't know I possessed, and I gasped in the darkness as his eyes began to glow with an inner light. Suddenly, everything changed. The air around us became charged and electric. In an instant, I could see everything. The subway car lurched, the lights sputtering back to life as if a spell had been broken, and the world snapped back into normal focus. The other passengers stirred, complaining about the delay, and the man, the watcher, stood up. "This isn't over, Mia. We'll be in touch." Then, in an instant, he was gone, not through a door, not to another part of the car. He just vanished, and the train began to move again. I sank back into my seat, my mind reeling with what had just happened. I felt a mixture of fear and excitement as we pulled into the next station. I staggered out onto the platform, gulping in the stale subway air like it was the freshest mountain breeze. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I took it out with trembling hands. A text from an unknown number said, "Welcome to the truth, Mia. Your training begins tomorrow." I stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to hide and act like nothing was happening, but a larger part of me felt as though it was waking up after a long sleep. Eagerly, even as I ascended to the street, the city appeared different, brighter, and more alive. I could feel the pulse of millions of lives all around me, a symphony of thoughts and emotions I had never before noticed. I looked up at the night sky, which was barely visible through the skyscrapers and light pollution, and I knew that the watchers were waiting somewhere up there. I had to decide whether to embrace this newfound power and the mysterious beings that came with it, or to flee. I was on a new path, and somewhere in the shadows of the city, I knew the watchers were grinning. The full moon hung low over the ocean, casting a silvery path across the waves. It was supposed to be the ideal night for a midnight swim, but as I walked home, my mind racing with possibilities, I realized that the decision had already been made. Something big and powerful had just brushed against my leg, and it made my blood run cold. My name is Jeff, and what began as a carefree beach night with friends had just turned into a nightmare. We were 4 recent college graduates, Mark, Zoe, Tyler, and I, celebrating our final summer of freedom before entering the real-world bind of corporate jobs and adult responsibilities. The tranquil lapping of the waves suddenly seemed menacing, concealing whatever lurked beneath the surface. Then, without warning, my friend Mark vanished under the water with a strangled cry. I believe Tyler suggested a midnight swim, saying, "Come on, guys, I'm already stripping down to my swim trunks." When are we ever going to get a chance like this again? A full moon, warm water, and not another soul for miles. The day had been perfect, with sunshine, beach volleyball, cold beers, and a bonfire as we watched the sunset. This was supposed to be the grand finale of our trip, which lasted 3 days. I had started to say something, but Mark's abrupt disappearance cut me off, and now, as the ripples from where he'd vanished spread outward, we all stared at each other in shock. Zoe called out, her voice trembling, "Mark, this isn't funny," but we had waited until the water reached our chests, laughing and splashing each other like kids. When that happened, I felt something solid and alive brush past my leg, and I froze, my laughter dying in my throat. "Guys." I could feel panic rising in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me, but I forced it down, focusing on the rhythmic movement of my arms cutting through the water. We were about halfway to the beach when I heard Zoe scream, and when I turned around, I saw that she was being pulled backward by her arms. Mark was a strong swimmer, but he had gone under so quickly without even making a splash that we needed to get out of the water. Tyler said, "We need to get out of the water." Tyler and I swam towards her, but it felt like we were swimming through molasses. The water seemed to have thickened and was resisting our every move. Zoe vanished beneath the surface just as we got to her. I yelled no and dove down after her. The salt water stung my eyes as I looked into the murky depths for a moment, seeing nothing but then a flash of pale skin and a cloud of bubbles. Zoe was about 10 feet below me, sinking quickly, and something wrapped around her leg. I was unable to see any details because of the moonlight filtering through the water. It was just a long, sinuous shape that didn't belong to any sea creature. I knew my lungs were burning, so I surfaced for air, and Tyler was right next to me. His eyes were wide with fear. "Did you see her?" he gasped, and I nodded, unable to speak. We both took deep breaths and dove down again, this time finding no sign of Zoe but only endless dark water. We emerged panting and confused, and the shore seemed so far away that we had to leave. He was right, whatever was in the water with us, we were no match for it, and our only chance was to reach shore and call for help. We started swimming again, pushing ourselves to the limit, and every splash and ripple made my heart race. I kept expecting to feel something grab my leg and drag me down into the depths like Mark and Zoe, but when Tyler let out a choked gasp, only about 20 yards from shore, I turned to see him struggling against something I was unable to see, his head barely above the water. "Jess," and he cried out, reaching for my assistance. I swam towards him, feeling like lead, and as I got to him, his eyes widened in terror. He opened his mouth to scream, but all that came out was a gurgle, and I froze, breathing in short, panicked gasps. I was alone now, and whatever was in the water had taken my friends, and I was next. The sensible part of my brain knew that I had to swim to shore, but fear had paralyzed me, preventing me from moving or thinking. I'd like to say that I faced my fate bravely and went down fighting, but the truth is that I panicked and thrashed in the water, trying desperately to get away from the approaching horror. It was like trying to run in a nightmare. As I floated there waiting for the inevitable, I saw it, a dark shape moving through the water towards me just beneath the surface. It was massive, easily twice the size of a person. As it got closer, I could make out more details. It wasn't just one creature, but many writhing masses of tentacles or tendrils moving in unison. The mass was directly beneath me, and no matter how hard I swam, I didn't seem to move. I could feel the water churning around my legs as tendrils wrapped around them. They were cold, incredibly strong, and covered in a slime that made my skin crawl. I took one last desperate breath before being pulled under. The underwater world was silent, broken only by the pounding of my heart in my ears. When I opened my eyes, they were stinging from the salt water, and I was confronted by something unlike anything I had ever seen. Nothing I could have ever imagined, a central mass pulsing with bioluminescent light, surrounded by dozens of eyes of all sizes and countless writhing appendages, and as I stared into those alien eyes, my lungs screaming for air, something impossible happened. I heard a voice in my head saying, "Do not be afraid." The words were not so much heard as they were felt. "You are chosen." The tendrils around my legs relaxed, and I was suddenly propelled upwards, breaking the surface with a gasp, gulping in air as if I had never tasted it. Before anyone could respond, the water around us started to glow, and the creature, if that's what it was, rose partially out of the water in the moonlight. I could see it clearly now, and it was beautiful in another unearthly way, its skin shimmering with patterns of light that seemed to convey emotions and thoughts. "You have been chosen," the voice. Mark, Zoe, and Tyler were also there, and they all looked as confused and terrified as I felt about what had happened. Mark stuttered, his eyes wild. Our minds were filled with images of vast underwater cities, civilizations that had risen and fallen while humanity was still learning to make fire, knowledge, and technology beyond our wildest dreams. "We had watched your kind for millennia." The voice continued, "Now it is time for contact. You will be our ambassadors. Messengers to the surface, witnesses to what Zoe asked," and the creature's lights pulsed in response, just barely a whisper. As the adrenaline wore off, we all started to shiver as the night air felt cool on our wet skin. Tyler asked in a shaky voice, and we all looked at each other before turning back to the now calm ocean, where the moon's reflection was undisturbed as if nothing unusual had happened. Deeps, we found ourselves being gently pushed towards the shore by invisible currents. We staggered onto the beach, our minds reeling from what we'd experienced. We had come on this trip hoping for one last adventure before entering the adult world, and we had definitely found it. Our lives would never be the same, and somewhere out there beneath the waves, an ancient civilization was waiting for us to tell their story so that the world would finally know the truth about what lies in the depths of our oceans. Our midnight swim had become the start of humanity's greatest adventure. We huddled together on the sand, trying to process what had happened, and I couldn't help but laugh. When I checked my watch at 2:37 a.m., the only sound in the otherwise silent hospital ward was the constant beep of the heart monitor. Adventure, and we were selected to lead the way. There was no breeze in the sealed ward, and this floor had been closed for renovations for months. My name is Sarah Chin, and I have been a night shift nurse at Mercy General Hospital for 5 years. After a few more hours, I noticed a patient standing at the end of the hallway, her hospital gown swaying gently as if caught in a breeze. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night, though, as I had witnessed all of it, from coding patients to full moon craziness to the occasional escaped patient from the psych ward. It had begun as a routine shift, with me making rounds, checking on my patients, and relaxing at the nurse's station with a cup of lukewarm coffee. The 3 north wards were unusually quiet, with only 3 patients, who were all stable and sleeping soundly. I was catching up on charting when I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, somehow charged with it. The first time I saw her, I caught a glimpse of a figure in a pale gown at the far end of the hallway. I turned to look directly at her, but she was gone. I shook my head, blaming it on too little sleep and too much caffeine, but a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me something wasn't right, so I decided to do another round just to ease my nerves. I felt a sort of static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I looked around, wondering if a storm was coming, but the windows showed only clear, starry skies. As I passed the rooms, I glanced at each patient. Mr. Johnson in 301 was snoring softly. Mrs. Patel in 302 had her oxygen machine humming steadily, and in 303 I froze. The bed was empty, the bathroom was empty, and I was prepared to call a code yellow for a missing patient, but as I reached for the phone, I saw her again. She was standing at the intersection of our ward and the closed wing, and her long, dark hair fell past her back to me. Shoulders and her slender body was silhouetted against the darkness. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. "You shouldn't be out of bed. Let me help you back to your room." She didn't answer, didn't move, and just stood there perfectly still. I pushed it aside, knowing that I was a professional and that this was obviously a confused patient in need of assistance. I walked towards her, my footsteps making an unusually loud noise on the linoleum floor. "Ma'am?" As I approached, I asked, "Are you all okay?" But she didn't respond. The young woman was only a few feet away when I reached out to touch her shoulder, and my hand went straight through her. I staggered back, my heart racing, and the figure slowly turned, and I found myself looking into her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were completely black, like empty voids. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead of saying anything, a low, haunting moan came out. The hallway lights flickered, and I felt a wave of coldness wash over me. I'm not proud of it, but in that moment, all my training, all my experience, and went out the window. I hurried back to the nurse's station, my breath coming in short gasps. I grabbed the phone, my fingers shaking, and dialed security. "This is Nurse Chin on 3 North. I said, "As soon as they pick up, I need assistance immediately. There's an intruder on the floor." The security guard asked, sounding skeptical, "Are you sure it's not just a patient out of bed?" There must be a rational explanation for what I'd witnessed. Perhaps I was more exhausted than I realized. Perhaps someone was pulling a complex prank, but deep down I knew what I'd witnessed wasn't natural or human. The elevator dinged and 2 security guards emerged. I quickly told them what had happened, omitting the part about my ghostly woman, but the corridor was empty and the oppressive atmosphere persisted like the air before a thunderstorm. The older guard said, looking concerned, "We'll do a sweep of the floor." You stay here at the station. If you see anything at all, you call us immediately." I nodded, grateful for their presence, and as they moved down the hallway, their flashlights cutting through the shadows, I felt some of my fear subside. Whatever was going on, I wasn't alone anymore, but as the minutes passed, my uneasiness grew. I was about to call them on the radio because the floor wasn't that large and they should have returned by now. The lights all went out at once, even the emergency lights didn't work. The only light was the dim glow from the computer screens at the nurse's station. In the sudden darkness, I heard footsteps coming from the direction of the closed wing, but they didn't sound like the security guards' heavy footsteps. Instead, they were lighter and almost ethereal. I fumbled for my phone and turned on its flashlight, which seemed to the ghostly woman was there, but she wasn't alone behind her. I could see dozens of other figures in hospital gowns, all with those same black, empty eyes, and they started to move towards me. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, so I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body refusing to move. As they got closer, I started to recognize some of them, including Mr. Cooper, who had passed away from a heart attack last week. We lost Mrs. Sanchez, a cancer patient, and at the front, my breath caught in my throat. It was Dr. Patel, my mentor, who had died years ago. His cold presence surrounded me, making it difficult for me to breathe. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end, but then I felt a warm hand on my shoulder. I opened my eyes to see Dr. Patel, not the ghostly version, but the kind one who smiled at me and said, "It's all right, Sarah," his voice echoing as if we weren't here to hurt. He said, "Once a year on this night, the boundary between our world and yours weakens. We can cross over just for a little while," but I asked, looking around at the sea of familiar faces, "Why come back?" A sad smile crossed Dr. Patel's face. "Some of us have unfinished business, some just want to see their loved ones one last time," and some paused, looking at me intently. Some came to deliver a message, and some leaned in close. As he spoke, the other spirits started to fade into the darkness, and by the time he was done, I was alone in the hallway once more, the lights flickering back to life. I stood there in shock as the reality of what had just happened hit me. The elevator dinged and the security guard came out looking perplexed. "Did you call us?" One asked, "Did you get a call?" But when we had arrived up here earlier, everything seemed fine. I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again, wondering how I could possibly explain what I had just witnessed. I heard myself say, "Everything's fine now," and as they departed, I sank into the chair at the nurse's station, my mind reeling. I knew that I would have to make some difficult decisions in the morning, and I couldn't ignore the message Dr. Patel had given me, but for the time being, as the first rays of dawn started to peek through the windows, I gave myself permission to just breathe and exist in a world that had suddenly grown much larger, much stranger, and infinitely more amazing than I had ever imagined. The night shift would never be the same again, and neither would I. The baby monitor's crackle of static sent a shiver down my spine. I had put the kids to bed an hour earlier, but what I heard next chilled me to the bone. It wasn't the sound of a fussy baby or a child having a nightmare, but rather a man's low, menacing voice whispering, "I see you." I froze, my eyes darting to the front door, which I had locked hours earlier, then to the stairs leading to the kids' bedrooms. I'm a 17-year-old high school senior who watches the neighbor's kids a few nights a week to save money for college. The Petersons were great. They had two adorable kids, Mia, who is 5, and Ethan, who is 2. They always paid well, and I'd been sitting for them for almost a year, and nothing unusual had ever happened until tonight. It had been a typical evening when I arrived at 6 p.m. The first few hours went smoothly. We had pizza, played some board games, and I was able to get both kids bathed and in bed on time. I had settled down on the living room couch with my homework and enjoyed the silence when I noticed that Mr. and Mrs. Peterson had left money for pizza on the refrigerator, emergency contact numbers on the fridge eyes. and strict instructions for the kids to be in bed by 8:30 and return around midnight. Mrs. Peterson had said, smiling warmly, "Call if you need anything." When I noticed a strange movement outside the window, I got up to take a look, but the front yard was deserted and illuminated by the orange glow of the streetlights. I assumed it was a cab or something, but as I sat down again, I couldn't get rid of the sensation that I was being watched. Every clatter of the old house made me jump, and I turned on the TV in the hopes that the background noise would help me relax. It was just after 11 p.m. My first instinct was to run out of the house and call the police when I heard that eerie voice over the baby monitor, but I couldn't leave the kids alone because what if the intruder was already up there with them? I picked up my phone to call for help, but I was worried that any noise would alert the intruder, so I chose to text Mr. Peterson instead. A few seconds after I hit send, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mr. Peterson, which I declined out of fear that the ringtone might have been heard. Instead, I texted again, "Can't talk, he's upstairs with the kids. Please hurry." The response came quickly, and I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding so hard, wondering if I should go up and try to get the kids out or if doing so would put them in more danger. Before I could make up my mind, I heard footsteps overhead, slow, deliberate steps moving from one bedroom to the other, and then there was silence. The baby monitor crackled to life again, so I went upstairs. "Emily." That voice sent chills down my spine. The kids wanted to say good night. Panic threatened to take over. How did he know my name? What had he done to Mia and Ethan? I looked at my phone in the hopes of seeing flashing lights outside, but the street was still dark and quiet. I took a deep breath to regain my composure. I couldn't just stand here while some maniac was upstairs with those helpless kids. I searched for a weapon or anything I could use to protect myself, but my gaze fell on a heavy table lamp. Much, but it was better than nothing. I unplugged it, gripped it tightly, my palms sweating against the cool ceramic, and put my foot on the first step. It creaked loudly, and I froze, listening intently, but I heard nothing from upstairs. I started to climb slowly and carefully, and each step felt like an eternity. The only sounds coming from upstairs were my ragged breathing and my heart pounding. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped trying to decide which room to check first. Mia's room was closest. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the slight squeak of the hinges, and saw a jar. The room was dark, lit only by Mia's nightlight, and I could see her small form under the covers, seemingly asleep, but where was the intruder? I moved to Mia's bed and gently shook her shoulder, whispering, "Mia, wake up, we need to go." She didn't stir, and as I pulled back the covers, I discovered that it wasn't Mia, but rather pillows arranged to look like a sleeping child. The floorboard creaked behind me, so I turned and raised the lamp, ready to swing, but the doorway was empty, the hallway beyond was dark, and my breathing was still coming in short gasps. Where were the kids? Where was the intruder? I backed out of Mia's room, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, and Ethan's room was next. The door was closed with a trembling hand, and as my fingers touched the cool metal, I heard a child's giggle coming from downstairs. I froze, wondering how I could have been at the bottom. I turned to run back downstairs, but as I did, the door to Ethan's room swung open, and the man stood there as a dark silhouette against the deeper darkness of the room. He was tall, impossibly tall, his head almost touching the top of the doorframe, and he said, "Hello, Emily." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The intruder hadn't been upstairs. He'd been downstairs with me the entire time, and now he had the kids. I heard the same spooky whisper on the baby monitor, "I've been waiting for you." I didn't think, I just reacted. I swung the lamp as hard as I could, aiming for where I thought his head would be. There was a sickening crunch as it connected, and the figure crumpled to the ground. I didn't wait to see if he was dead. Instead, I ran, taking the stairs two at a time, almost falling in my haste. I could hear the children's voices now coming from the kitchen, so I rushed into the room, ready to pick them up and flee, but Mia and Emily and Mr. Peterson were standing next to them, looking confused and worried, while Ethan was happily eating ice cream at the kitchen table. Emily said, "Are you okay? With a furrowed brow, you look like you've seen a ghost." I stood there, gasping for air, my mind trying to process what I was seeing, but the intruder upstairs was heard on the baby monitor. Mr. Peterson stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Emily." No one else was present, so we arrived home early and discovered the children awake. They could have a midnight snack. I shook my head, unable to think clearly. This couldn't be real. Mrs. Peterson led me to a chair, her face etched with worry. "I think you might have fallen asleep, sweetie, and had a nightmare." Maybe as the adrenaline wore off, doubt had begun to creep in. Had it all been a dream, though? I hit him. Mr. Peterson disappeared upstairs with the lamp, returning a short while later. "All the lamps are where they should be, Emily," and when the Petersons tried to reassure me that it was only a bad dream, likely caused by stress from school, I sat there with my mind reeling. They even offered to drive me home, but as I packed my belongings to leave, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. The voice on the baby monitor, the sense of being watched, all of it felt too vivid to be a nightmare. As Mr. Peterson drove me home, I stared out the window at the quiet and darkness. A lone figure stood on the empty road ahead, thumb outstretched, and as we sped past, I caught a glimpse of a tired face and desperate eyes. I knew one thing for sure. I would never say, "Wait, what was that in the rearview mirror?" For a moment, I thought I saw a figure in the back seat smiling at me with too many teeth, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The shimmering heat haze on the horizon changed into a human shape, and my heart skipped a beat. My name is Mike Callahan, and what began as a cross-country road trip with my wife swiftly turned into an unimaginable nightmare. We had been driving for hours through the Nevada desert, the monotonous landscape broken only by the occasional gas station or ramshackle diner. "Did you see that?" she asked. I nodded, my knuckles white on the steering wheel because I had seen it, and I knew we'd see it again, the same hitchhiker miles down the road and possibly ahead of us. It was our 5th wedding anniversary, and we made the decision to the first few days had been wonderful as we drove from our San Francisco home to the Grand Canyon via the scenic route through the American Southwest. We had played silly road trip games, sung along to old songs on the radio, and marveled at the changing landscapes. However, as we entered the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert, the air felt heavier and the silence was more eerie. Even the radio seemed affected, picking up nothing but static no matter how much I fiddled with the dial. About an hour into the journey, we first saw the hitchhiker. As we sped past at 70 miles per hour, I caught a fleeting glimpse of tan skin, ragged clothes, and a backpack that had seen better days. Sarah asked, twisting in her seat to look back, "You know the rules, honey? Never pick up hitchhikers, especially out here in the middle of nowhere." I shook my head. "You know the rules, honey? Never pick up hitchhikers, especially out here in the middle of nowhere." She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I told her that someone else would probably pick him up, and we went on our way, but I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling that had crept into the pit of my stomach. About 20 minutes later, we saw him again in the same desperate stance, the same clothes, but this was impossible because we had been driving at full speed and there was no way he could have gotten ahead of us. "Mike," Sarah said, her voice tight with confusion, "isn't that it?" It can't be, but even as I said it, I knew it was impossible. Sarah and I sat in stunned silence for a few minutes, trying to make sense of what we had just witnessed. Perhaps it was a different hitchhiker who happened to look similar, or perhaps the heat and monotony of the desert were playing tricks on our minds, but deep down we both knew something wasn't right. The same man we drove past again, and this time I got a clearer look at his face. His features were gone, almost skeletal, and there was something strange about his eyes, which seemed too dark and deep, like black holes in his face. About 15 minutes after the third time we saw him, Sarah screamed because he was standing in the middle of our lane, right in front of us. I applied the brakes and the tires screeched as we skittered to a stop just feet from the figure. Sarah's knuckles were white where she gripped the dashboard, and the hitchhiker stood still, staring at us through those impenetrably dark sunglasses. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pointed at us, and my God, Mike, what do we do? Sarah whimpered, and I asked myself the same thing. My instinct told me to put the car in reverse and drive as far away from this thing as possible, but a morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I rolled down my window, and the hot air that entered the car brought with it a smell that I could only describe as decay, like something that has been baking in the sun for a long time. What do you want? I called out, sounding thin and reedy in the vast emptiness surrounding us. The hitchhiker's mouth moved, but the sound that emerged wasn't human. It was like radio static punctuated by clicks and words that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then, without warning, he disappeared, not ran away, not faded into the distance, just disappeared there for a second. Sarah and I looked at each other, both of us pale and trembling. Did that just happen? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, trying to make sense of what we had just gone through, but there was as the sun started to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, we noticed a small diner on the side of the road. By tacit agreement, I pulled in because we both needed a break, a chance to gather ourselves and perhaps find some normalcy in a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. Our hands were shaking, so I put the car back into drive and gradually accelerated. We drove in silence, each of us jumping at every shadow and shimmering heat mirage on the horizon. It was almost deserted, with only a few truckers at the counter and an elderly man in a booth by the window. As we slid into a booth, a waitress came up to her name tag and introduced herself as Darlene. She asked, "What can I get you folks?" with her pen resting over her notepad. We ordered coffee and pie, and as she left, I found myself blurting out, "Have you ever heard any strange stories about this stretch of road?" Darlene paused and turned back to us with a frown. It's odd how I hesitated, unsure of how to explain without coming across as crazy or something. Darlene's face showed a mixture of concern and recognition. Perhaps she looked around the diner and then leaned in close to say, "You saw him, didn't you?" The hitchhiker, Sarah gasped, and I felt a chill go down my spine. "You know about him?" I asked, and Darlene nodded solemnly. "He's been haunting this road for as long as anyone can remember," she said. "Some people believe he's the ghost of a man who died out here forever trying to catch a or to safety." She straightened up and her expression became guarded, "But that's just silly superstition. Of course, whatever you saw was just a trick of the light, and the desert can play havoc with your senses." With that, she hurried off to get our order, and Sarah and I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what we just heard Mike Sarah say. Finally, her voice trembled, "I want to go home," and I nodded. I reached across the table to squeeze her hand, and we'll depart first thing. We'll find a motel for the night and then return to California at dawn. But as I was saying that, a persistent doubt crept into my mind. Would it really be that simple? Would the hitchhiker let us go? We ate our pie in silence, both of us deep in thought. As we were paying the bill, I noticed the elderly man in the window booth watching us closely. He said, "You can't outrun him," in a gruff, elderly voice, and once he set his sights on you, there's no escape. I felt Sarah stiffen next to me. "He's not looking for a ride, son. He's looking for someone to take his place on this godforsaken stretch of road so he can finally move on." A chill went through me. "How do you know all this?" A sad smile crossed the old man's weathered face, because I've been running from him for 40 years since that night when I drove past him, thinking I was being smart by not picking up a hitchhiker. I asked, even though a part of me screamed not to engage, not to learn more. I nodded and led her out of the diner as we walked to our car. The old man's words reverberated in my mind as we drove through the night, pushing the speed limit and both of us jumping at every shadow on the road. "You can't escape him," he repeated softly, scanning the darkening desert outside the window. "No matter how far or fast you drive, he'll always be there waiting until you give in or until you find someone else to take your place." The desert stretched out in front of us, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my bones that our journey was far from over. The hitchhiker was out there waiting, and sooner or later we would have to face him again. The first knock came at midnight, and no matter how quickly we went or how many miles we put behind us, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were being followed. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see a gaunt figure in the back seat, smiling at me with too many teeth, ready to claim his replacement. I dismissed the faint tapping, which was barely audible over the roaring wind, as being caused by debris being thrown against the lighthouse door. However, as the night went on, the banging became louder and more persistent around 3 in the morning. As I descended the spiral staircase with my flashlight in hand, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that whatever was waiting on the other side of that door wasn't human. It had turned into a pounding that shook the very foundation of my lonely home, and the storm was still raging, making any visitors impossible. My name is Jack Harper, and I've been there for the past 5 years. I have been the keeper of the Black Rock Lighthouse, which is situated on a small rocky island off the coast of Maine. For more than a century, Black Rock has guided ships safely through dangerous waters. It's a lonely life, but I've come to love the tranquility, the tide's rhythm, and the satisfaction of keeping this beacon of hope for sailors working. That is, until that stormy night in late October. The day had begun normally enough, and I had gone about my daily routine, checking the light, maintaining the weather logging equipment, but as evening drew near, the sky had grown ominous. The weather report crackled over my radio, alerting me to an unexpected storm system moving in gale-force winds, heavy rain, and possibly hail. I, in effect, battened down the hatches, securing everything that might be blown away by nightfall. The storm had hit with full-force rain, lashing against the windows, being driven sideways by howling winds, and sending spray high enough to reach the lower windows of the lighthouse. I felt proud as I ascended the stairs to light the beacon. On nights like this, my light might be the only thing separating a ship from disaster. I settled in for the night, making a pot of strong coffee and taking out a well-worn paperback. The storm provided a constant backdrop of sound, wind, rain, and crashing waves, which was almost calming in its intensity. At first, I thought I had imagined it when I heard a knock at the door. But who could possibly be out? The island was deserted except for me in this weather, and the closest shore was miles away. I went back to reading, but a few minutes later, I heard 3 different knocks that were hardly audible over the storm. I put my book down and listened carefully for a few long moments, during which time there was only the sound of the storm. Then, just as I was about to convince myself that I had imagined it, the knocking became louder this time, sending a shiver down my spine. This couldn't have happened. No one could have reached the island in this weather, and even if I tried to explain it by thinking that maybe some debris had blown against the door or maybe a piece of the lighthouse was coming loose in the wind. But as the night went on, the knocking became more frequent and persistent. It moved around the lighthouse, sometimes at the front door and other times at the back, and by 3 in the morning, it even seemed to be coming from the windows high above. They would have radioed ahead. I always kept my radio on, especially during storms. Every instinct told me to stay put and wait out the storm and pretend I couldn't hear the impossible knocking, but another part of me needed to know what was happening with shaking hands. I picked up my heavy-duty flashlight, whose weight was comforting in my hand, and started to descend the spiral staircase. As I got closer to the door, I could feel the pounding intensify. It had become a constant rhythmic pounding that I could feel through the floors. My heart was pounding, my palms were sweating on the flashlight, and I reached for the door handle. But then I thought, what if it was someone who needed help? Maybe it was a shipwreck survivor who had somehow made it to the island? I couldn't just leave them out there in the storm. Taking a deep breath, I undid the locks and pulled the door open, but the wind almost knocked me off my feet, squinting the flashlight against the onslaught. But no one was there, so I swept the beam of relief when I saw it just at the edge of my flashlight beam down by the shore, a figure standing motionless in the middle of the storm's chaos. I blinked, certain I was seeing things, but when I looked again, it was still there, tall and thin, and appeared to be wearing some sort of long coat that whipped about in the wind. Relief was followed quickly by confusion as I realized there was nothing but wind, rain, and crashing waves out towards the rocks. A wave of unease overcame me as I was about to go inside and radio for help when the figure moved, raising one arm pointing directly at me. Then, impossibly, it started to walk forward, not along the shore but straight towards me across the surface of the churning water. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. I said, my voice almost lost in the howling wind, "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there facing the lighthouse facing me. The knocking started again, but this time it was focused on the door directly in front of me, with slow, heavy thuds that shook dust from the ceiling. I backed away, my mind reeling, wondering what was out there and what it wanted. The pounding continued getting louder and more insistent, and I could see the door shuddering in its frame with each impact. I must be dreaming or experiencing hallucinations from lack of sleep, but even through the thick door I could hear its slow, deliberate footsteps coming up the path to the lighthouse. I didn't stop until I reached the top of the lighthouse, bursting out onto the gallery that surrounded the beacon. The storm was raging around me, with wind and rain whipping my face. I gripped the railing and peered down at the lighthouse's entrance, which was open, as I watched a figure emerge. Even from this height, I could tell it wasn't human because its movements were too fluid and its proportions were off. It paused, then slowly turned its face up towards me, giving me a glimpse of pale, waterlogged flesh with eyes that glowed with an unsettling as it approached. The wind carried its voice to me in the form of rushing water and grinding stones that somehow formed words. It said, "Your time has come," and I stood frozen in horror, unable to move. The phosphorescent light of a mouth that opened far too wide, revealing row upon row of sharp teeth, raised one long distorted arm pointing at me again, and then started to climb, scaling the outside of the lighthouse instead of using the stairs inside. We weren't just here to guide ships. We were guardians keeping at bay things that lurked in the deep that saw our lights as a challenge, and sometimes those things came to replace us. As the creature reached the gallery, pulling itself up with those long distorted limbs, I decided that I was the keeper of Black Rock Lighthouse and that I would fulfill my duty. I turned to the beacon, which was still shining bright despite the ST storm, with a silent apology to any ships that might be depending on it. I turned it off. The creature hesitated as though it was perplexed by the sudden darkness, so I took advantage of its hesitancy and sprinted down the stairs. I could hear it behind me scratching and chittering as it gave chase, but I had lived in this lighthouse for years, so I knew every step and turn. I ran out into the storm, never stopping until I reached the shore, where I turned to face the creature that had followed me. We stood there for a long time, human and monster facing each other in the middle of the storm. But now that we were outside the lighthouse, it seemed less certain of itself. "You are the keeper," it said, its voice full of confusion and what might have been fear. I stand my ground, rain and sea spray soaking me to the bone, I replied. And this is my light, my duty. You have no power here. Then, slowly, the creature started to retreat, moving backwards step by step until it reached the water's edge with it, took one last look at me before sinking beneath the waves. When it vanished, I hurried back to the lighthouse, my hands shaking as I respotted the beacon's bright beam piercing the storm. I spent the rest of the night in the lantern room, watching the sea for any indication that the creatures would return. But there was nothing but the storm's gradual calm, and finally the first rays of dawn. As I sit here writing this in my log, I'm still not sure I believe what happened. It could have been a stress-induced hallucination. The storm has passed and a new day is dawning. I have work to do, cleaning up debris, checking for damage, and logging the night's events in carefully coded language that won't raise alarms with my superiors. However, as I go about my duties, I'll keep an eye on the sea because I know deep down that it was real, that there are things out there in the deep that see our lights as a challenge, and that as long as there are lighthouse keepers, we'll be here to face them. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots reverberated through the eerily silent forest. I've been a ranger here for 15 years, but I'd never seen the woods so still and empty. No bird song, no small animals scuttling, not even the buzz of insects. Just an impressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. As I pushed deeper into the heart of the forest, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was walking into a trap that had been waiting for me for a long time. I'm the keeper of Black Rock Lighthouse, and I'll be ready when the knocking comes again. I'm Sarah Connor, and I've been devoted to preserving the Whispering Pines National Forest for a very long time. At 38, I believed I had witnessed everything. Wildfires, hikers, lost hikers, and the occasional poacher. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found that crisp autumn morning. It began with hikers reporting strange markings on trees, which I initially dismissed as the work of bored teenagers or overzealous nature enthusiasts. But as the reports continued to come in, each more disturbing than the last, I realized the morning was cool and misty, which is typical for October in this part of the country. I left at dawn with my backpack full of supplies for a day's hike. However, as I drove deeper into the forest, following the GPS coordinates from the most recent report, something felt strange. The mist seemed thicker than usual, clinging to the trees in a way that made them appear almost skeletal, and the silence god. I've always loved the tranquility of the forest, but this was different. I parked my truck at the trail, head and set out on foot. The path was familiar, I had hiked it countless times, but today it felt strange. The trees seemed to tower over me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. After about 2 miles, I noticed the first marking, a complex swirl of lines that seemed to change and shift the longer I looked at it. I took a picture with my phone and then reached out to touch the carving, which felt warm under my fingers. The wood was still oozing sap. As I continued down the trail, I came across more symbols. They appeared at irregular intervals, always on the largest, oldest trees, and each one was unique, but they all gave me the same uneasy feeling that they were watching me. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew larger, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes, and the undergrowth became dense with something. It was much warmer than it should have been, and I jerked my hand back, my heart racing. Nothing had made this mark non-human. A low rhythmic chanting came from somewhere up ahead, and as I was about to turn around, I heard it. The sound sent a chill down my spine, but I persisted because I had to know what was happening to my forest. I checked my GPS, frowning at the screen, and it showed that I was miles off course in a section of the forest that didn't match any of my maps, but that was impossible because I knew these woods like the back of my hand. I emerged into a clearing and froze, struggling to process what a circle of rough H-shaped monoliths, each about 20 feet tall, stood in the middle of the scene. They were all covered in the same weird symbols I had seen on the tree, but what really chilled me was what was happening inside the circle. A group of people in long robes were dancing slowly and synchronized, and as I watched the words in a language I had never heard, their chanting became louder. I ducked behind a tree, my heart racing. What the hell was this cult? How had they constructed this? As I watched, one of the figures separated from the group and moved to the center of the circle, raising its arms. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and then the air in the center of the circle started to ripple like heat haze, but more substantial and real. The ripple grew until it formed a shimmering portal about 10 feet across, and through that portal I saw a glimpse of something that wasn't Earth, our skies, or creatures that couldn't be described. I don't know how long I ran, but time seemed to lose all meaning in that twisted version of my forest, and then I burst out. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, but all of a sudden all activity in the circle stopped as one of the robed figures turned to look in my direction. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush branches, whipping at my face as I heard their footsteps moving unnaturally quickly while they were chanting. Of the trees, and ended up back at my truck. I struggled with the keys, my hands shaking so much that I could hardly get them in the ignition, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, I happened to glance in my rearview mirror. The forest behind me was dark, with trees pressed up against the road, and just at the edge of the tree line, I noticed a line of robed figures standing motionless and watching me drive away. I didn't stop until I got to the ranger station, where my coworker Mike came over and sat me down with a cup of strong coffee. I told him everything I had to say, and to his credit, Mike listened without interjecting. When I was done, he was silent for a while, and then he said gently, "I think you need to take some time off. The stress of the job, it can get to you sometimes, no." I interrupted him, "Mike, and I'm not crazy." I checked my phone, took pictures of the symbols with trembling hands, and when I opened the photo gallery, my heart fell. In the days that followed, I attempted to return to locate the clearing to gather evidence, but it seemed as though the forest itself was working against me. Trails that should have been familiar were blurry and distorted, showing nothing but indistinct shapes in the woods. Mike patted my shoulder and said, "Get some rest, Sarah. We'll talk more tomorrow." However, I knew that there would never be any rest for me again, because I knew the truth. Something was happening in my forest that was beyond human comprehension, and I was the only one who knew about it. I've spent endless hours poring over old books researching occult symbols and interdimensional theories. I've contacted experts in everything from archaeology to quantum physics, and while some have expressed interest, none have been able to explain what I saw. As I sit here writing this down, I can't help but stare out my window at the forest that has been my home for so long. It looks the same. My GPS malfunctioned, and even my compass spun wildly, making it impossible for me to find true north. As always, there is a calm serenity, but I am aware of the truth and what lies beneath it. Sometimes, late at night, I believe I can hear the chanting carried on the wind, which serves as a reminder that what I witnessed was real. Somewhere in my forest, a door has been opened to another location, and I can't help but wonder what went through it and, more terrifyingly, what might happen next. I know one thing for sure though, I cannot deny this or act as though it never happened. Whatever cosmic horror has infiltrated my forest, whispering pines, I must confront it and figure out how to close that door, because if I don't, who will? I'm just a park ranger dealing with something that is beyond human comprehension, but I'm also the only one who knows the truth and the only one who can take action. So tomorrow, I'll return to the forest and continue to search, document, and try to understand in the hopes that I might discover a way to protect not only my forest but the entire world from whatever lies ahead. In a few hours, night will fall and the chanting will resume, but this time I'll be prepared and I'll find answers. Whatever happens, whatever I find, I know my life will never be the same. The world I knew and the reality I understood has been forever changed. On the other side of that shimmering portal, because that's my job as a ranger, and I protect the forest and everyone in it, even if what I'm protecting them from is beyond their wildest nightmares. When I saw a flash of movement in the darkness beyond my light, I realized that something was down here with me that didn't belong in this underwater cave. I'm not afraid, I'm determined, because the forest is calling and I have to answer. The beam of my flashlight cut through the murky water, revealing a twisted landscape of stalactites and narrow passages. My heart raced as I checked my air gauge, 700 psi, barely enough for 10 minutes. Nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of Syysycayan. It was supposed to be a routine dive, an opportunity to map out a newly discovered cave. My name is Alex Chin, and I am a cave diver, or at least I was until that fateful dive in the cenotes of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. I had been exploring underwater caves for over 10 years, pushing the boundaries of human endurance and technology to uncover the secrets hidden beneath the Earth's surface. On the morning of the dive, we arrived at the cenote early. The jungle surrounding us was still covered in mist, and as we prepared, I couldn't get rid of a feeling of unease. Perhaps it was the unusual stillness of the air or the way the normally crystal clear water seemed. I had put together a small team consisting of myself, my longtime diving partner Mike, and our local guide Carlos. We had spent days preparing, checking and double-checking our equipment, reviewing our dive plan, and talking about contingencies. I forced a smile when Alex asked, "You okay?" Seeing my hesitation, I said, "Yeah, just a little nervous energy, you know how it is before a big dive." He nodded, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Mike and I had been diving together for years, and he knew me well enough to sense when something was off. We checked our equipment one last time and slipped into the water. The coolness was a shock after the humid air, but it helped clear my head as we descended into the cave's mouth. For the first hour, everything went as planned. We moved slowly through the cave system mapping, marveling at the otherworldly beauty of the underwater formations. Delicate stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, while stalagmites reached up from the cave floor like the grasping fingers of some underground giant. We were about 3,000 feet into the cave when things started to go wrong. I was in the lead, with Mike about 20 feet behind me, and Carlos bringing up my primary light flickered as I was approaching a narrow passage. I paused and tapped the light to stabilize it, but it seemed weaker than before. I mentally noted that I should switch to my backup light if it happened again, and then I noticed a shadow moving at the edge of my light's beam. It vanished so quickly that I nearly convinced myself I had imagined it. I asked Mike if he had seen anything, and he shook his head, signaling for me to continue. I hesitated, then pressed on, and we were entering a large chamber when my light flickered once more, this time going out completely for a heart-stopping moment before spluttering back to life in that brief moment of darkness. I felt something brush past me, something big, and I spun around, my heart pounding, my light revealing nothing but empty water and Mike's worried face behind me. I signaled that I was switching to my backup light, trying to keep my hands steady as I did so, and as the brighter beam of my backup light cut through the water, I saw something that chilled my blood. Our guideline Carlos swam up, alerted by our unusual behavior, and when he saw the cut line, his eyes went wide. He started to tie it back together right away, his movements quick and precise despite the gravity of the situation. The thin rope that was our lifeline back to the surface had been severed, and the cut end drifted lazily in the water, mocking us with its frayed edges. I turned to Mike, my eyes wide with panic behind my mask, and he had seen it too. Without the guideline in a cave system this complex, we were in serious trouble. Situation as he worked, I scanned the chamber with my light and saw it again. A shape moving in the darkness beyond my beam of light. This time it was larger and moved with a fluid grace that was definitely not human. I tapped Mike's arm and pointed, and he nodded, having seen it too. We both watched, barely breathing, as the shape moved along the chamber's edge. It was difficult to make out details, but I was positive I saw the flicker of a tail and the glint of scales. Far too big to be any fish I knew. Carlos finished fixing the line and gave us the all clear, but as we were about to proceed, my light caught something swimming down the cave floor for a closer look, and I felt sick to my stomach. Half buried in the silt was a diving mask, and it wasn't just any mask. It was an antique mask used by divers 50 years ago. As I reached for it, a strong current swept through the chamber, taking us by surprise, spinning us around, and creating a cloud of silk that instantly made it impossible to see. I felt the guideline go tow in my hand, and I clung to it in a fight. The current only lasted a few seconds, but when it subsided and the silt started to settle, I realized with horror that I was alone. Mike and Carlos had left along with the guideline. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, so I forced myself to take slow, deep breaths to fight the urge to hyperventilate. Panic was a diver's worst enemy, especially in a situation like this. I checked my air gauge and it was 700 psi, which would have lasted me for about 10 minutes if I stayed. I started to move slowly through the chamber, sweeping my light back and forth. The water was still cloudy with disturbed silt, reducing my visibility to just a few feet. Every shadow seemed to move, and every rock formation looked like it might be my lost companions. Then, everything became clearer, and as I got closer, I caught a glimpse of a long serpentine body of fins that looked more like limbs, and it wasn't a fish. It was something I had never seen before, and it was watching me. I froze, torn between the instinct to run from this unknown creature and the need to find my friends. As I hovered there, my light started to flicker again, and I felt panicked because if my light went out down here in the complete darkness of the underwater cave, I would be dead. I fumbled from my backup to my backup, a small chemical light stick, attached to my equipment as I cracked it, creating a weak green glow around me. I noticed movement once more. The creature was circling me in ever tighter spirals. My air was running low, my lights were failing. I was lost in an underwater labyrinth, and I was being stalked by something that, by all rights, shouldn't be there. When I realized that I might die, a strange calmness overcame me. If this was going to be my end, I would meet it head-on. I stopped trying to run instead, and turned to face the creature as it entered the dim glow of I saw it clearly for the first time with my light stick. It was beautiful in an alien way, a combination of salamander and eel with hints of something almost human in its eyes and the shape of its head. It looked at me with what I could swear was curiosity, and slowly and deliberately it raised one of its limb-like fins and pointed past me down one of the tunnels leading out of the chamber. I hesitated, not sure if it was trying to help me or put me in more danger, but since my oxygen was running critically low, I knew I had no choice but to trust. I started swimming in the direction it had pointed, and to my amazement, it swam with me, its body flowing gracefully through the water as we went. I started to see signs, and I recognized markers left by previous divers. We were heading towards an exit when, just as my air gauge hit 0, we emerged into another chamber, where Mike and Carlos were as surprised to see me as I was to see them. As we ascended, I glanced back one last time, and the creature hovered at the top of the water. Most people were skeptical of our story of a lost underground creature guiding a diver to safety, but I know what I saw. I haven't gone cave diving since that day, but the memory of those perceptive eyes in the darkness of that strange, but somehow familiar creature has stayed with me. It's changed. The edge of the cave entrance watched us go. It raised its fin in what I could only interpret as a wave before disappearing back into the depths on the surface. As I sit here writing this account, I can't help but wonder if I will ever see that creature again, and if I will have the courage to follow it back into the depths to uncover the secrets it guards. Only time will tell. This is how I see the world and how I understand the limits of what we know. There are things down there in the dark places of our world that defy explanation, things that challenge everything we think we know about life on this planet, and sometimes if we're very lucky, these things might just save us when we need them most. However, one thing is certain: the underwater world will never look the same to me again. The first snowflake landed on my notebook, smearing the ink of my most recent sentence. I looked up at the darkening sky, a frown forming on my forehead. The weather report had predicted clear skies for at least another week, but as the snowfall increased and obscured my view of the valley below my cabin, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sudden drop in temperature. Something was seriously amiss in these mountains, and I felt a sinking my name is Liam Carter. And until that point, I was just another struggling novelist looking for solitude to finish my breakthrough book at the age of 35. I had had some success with a few thriller KN novels, but nothing that could be called a real career. This new book was supposed to change all of that. It's a horror story set in a remote mountain cabin where the protagonist finds herself alone by a freak storm and stalked by something that shouldn't be there. I had rented this cabin in the Rockies for a month with the intention of immersing myself in the atmosphere and finishing the first draft. When I told the owner, an elderly man named Frank, what I was writing, he gave me a strange look and said, "You might want to be careful what you wish for up here." His weathered face was serious. At the time, I had laughed it off, attributing it to local superstition. But now, as the snow swirled around my cabin, those words came back to me. Haunt me. I shut down my laptop and went to the window to look out at the quickly whitening scenery. The snow was falling so heavily that I could hardly see the tree line at the edge of the clearing, and my SUV, which was parked about 50 feet from the cabin, was already partially buried. A gust of wind howled around the cabin's eaves, sounding almost like a voice. I shook my head, trying to shake off the fantasy that I was allowing the atmosphere to get to me. This was just the type of weather I had hoped for to set the mood for I turned away from the window, deciding to light the fire and make some coffee, and as I made my way to the fireplace, I noticed something in the fresh snow on the cabin's small porch. A very large and human footprint. My heart raced. This couldn't be real. It must be a trick of the light, or perhaps some snow had fallen from the roof in an odd pattern. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully opened the front door, but the icy wind hit. I slammed the door shut, my mind reeling that this couldn't be happening. The creature I'd been writing about, a hybrid of a yeti and a Wendigo, wasn't real. It was fiction, a creation of my imagination, but as another howl of wind, I lifted the flashlight, illuminating the porch. The footprint was still there, even clearer now, and it was enormous, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long claw-like toes. Also, there was a trail of them leading away from the cabin and into the woods. Shook the cabin, sounding even more like a monstrous cry, but I wasn't sure anymore. I rushed to my laptop and opened the document I had been working on. As night fell and the storm grew stronger, Sarah realized she was no longer alone in her mountain refuge. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands shaking and my eyes scanning the words I had written just hours earlier. The creature left massive footprints in the fresh snow that led into the dark heart of the forest. I spent the next hour securing the cabin as best I could, locking all the shutters, barricading the doors, and building up the fire until the main room was almost unbearably warm. As night fell, I could hear the storm raging outside, punctuated by that haunting, almost human cry. Despite my best efforts to convince myself, however, I knew deep down in that primal part of my brain that deals with instinct and survival that something was out there, something I had brought into being with my words. When I heard a sound that wasn't part of the storm, a heavy tread on the porch steps followed by a low rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin, I backed away from the door. My mind racing with questions about what I had written and what weaknesses I had given this creature in the first place. I had been sitting in the warm glow of the electric lights when I was suddenly plunged into darkness, save for the flickering light of the fire. I fumbled for my flashlight, feeling my heart pounding so much that I could feel it in my throat. A huge figure appeared at the window, blocking out what little light came from the snow-reflected moon. I saw a glimpse of glowing eyes of teeth that seemed too many and too sharp to be real. The window shattered inward, and with it came the cold, not just the chill of the storm, but a bone-deep cold that seemed to sap the very life from the air. The protagonist of my story had learned that the monster couldn't cross running water, but there was no stream between me and it. There was a door that seemed terribly flimsy. As if in response to my thoughts, a massive force struck the other side of the door, causing the wood to splinter. Through the cracks, I saw a clawed hand covered in thick matted fur, and in that moment, my writer's mind kicked in, believing that if I had written this creature into existence, it would not be stopped by a wooden door. I ran through the kitchen, down the short hallway to the bedroom, and slammed the door shut behind me. As the creature continued to batter at the door, I started typing, my fingers flying over the keys, the words gushing out of me in a desperate stream of consciousness, but the creature was simply a manifestation of fear. A creation of the mind given form by the unique properties of this mountain. Even though it was a desperate, crazy idea, it was all I had. I took my laptop from the bedside table, flipped it open, and saw that the battery icon showed less than 10% remaining. It would have to be enough. The door burst inward, and I looked up to meet the creature's eyes. It was exactly as I had imagined, with massive fur covering a face that was a terrifying combination of human and animal features. It roared and opened its mouth, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth. But as it lunged for me, something changed. Its form seemed to waver like a mirage in the desert heat. I continued typing, giving the words everything I had, and the creature's form started to. The room was empty when I looked up from the screen, the broken door hanging from its hinges letting in a swirl of snow, but there was no sign of the creature. I thought it was all in my head, a hallucination brought on by stress and loneliness, but then I noticed the enormous footprints in the snow on the bedroom floor. Its roar of triumph turned to one of confusion, then fear, and finally it was gone, leaving behind nothing but a cold wind and the lingering scent of pine and snow. As the adrenaline started to wear off and I was shaky and exhausted, I couldn't help but laugh. It was hysterical, almost manic, because I knew with absolute certainty that I had just lived through the most amazing story of my life. The storm subsided as dawn broke, and as I stood on the porch and watched the sun rise over the snow-covered landscape, I felt a sense of awe and relief melt in the relative warmth of the cabin. I was terrified by the power of words, and the mountains all around me seemed to whisper secrets and untold stories. I knew then that I would stay for however long it took, not just the month I had planned, because there were more stories to be discovered and truths to write. As I turned to return inside, I noticed Frank's truck driving up the snow-covered road. He got out and looked at the damage to the cabin before settling on me. "It looks like you had a great night." I nodded, unable to come up with the right words to describe what had happened. Frank stared at me for a long time before he sighed and said, "Come on," pointing to his truck. "If you're ready, I've got some stories to tell you about these mountains and the power they hold." I followed him to the truck, laptop clutched to my chest, and realized that my life had changed forever, that the boundaries between reality and fiction had blurred, and that I was standing right on the edge of it. It was exciting since I was only learning how to utilize words and stories, but it was also frightening because I now realized their power.